Good evening and welcome to The Proof is Out There. We start with a question. What would you do if you saw a UFO and then found what looked like a piece of it on the ground? Well, we found someone determined to get to the bottom of a similar mystery, and he took matters into his own hands.
July 27th, 2018. Jesus Morales, a student from Ventura, California, is out walking his dog when his beloved pooch begins acting erratically. Jesus looks to the sky above, where he spots something that would change his life forever.
It was about 8 o'clock in the morning, and I saw the UFO. It just was floating in the air, hovering. And so when I got a little bit closer, I decided to start filming it.
What is that? What the f*** is that?
Jesus watches the orb for about 5 minutes. Then he says it begins to approach him, and that's when things get really weird.
My phone wasn't working, so I couldn't record. It looks like it's spinning, but it's mutating. The closest it came was about 5 to 10 feet, but then it took off into space, and I never seen it again.
The UFO may have disappeared after making Jesus's phone go haywire, but he believes it leaves something behind.
And I came upon this piece that was in the ground. It looked like melted aluminum.
Jesus decides to put the alleged space debris to the test.
I took it to a welder. He tried to melt it down.
That was aluminum, that would be melted.
And it didn't melt.
What if it explodes?
And a welder never seen any material like that. I'm 100% sure it was real, what I saw, and I believe.
Did Jesus come face to face with a UFO? According to journalist MJ Banayas, his is one of an increasing number of sphere sightings, including one remarkable case caught on camera and leaked to documentarian Jeremy Corbell.
One of the most famous spherical UFO encounters occurred in 2019. It was recorded by the USS Omaha, and it was over the Pacific Ocean.
Omaha approached with passive ability to launch Hilo ASAP.
The Omaha witnessed a large spherical object descend down and go into the ocean.
Splashed. Mark bearing and range.
We still today don't know what they saw and what that object was. It remains unidentified.
The Omaha sphere seemed to track and follow the Navy ship, much like Jesus claims his object tracked him.
So Jesus' story fits within the broader lore and legend of UFO encounters.
There have been numerous allegations that the U.S. government has acquired so-called meta-metals from UFOs, going back as far as the infamous Roswell crash in 1947. If that's true, would the feds also be interested in Jesus' find? Let's dispatch our experts to see what they can determine.
First, how can this object stand up to this kind of heat? We asked video effects designer and astronomer Mark D'Antonio.
You can take a torch like that and aim it at some steel, and it won't melt, no matter how long you do it. It might get it to look red hot, but it won't actually melt it. So metal like that doesn't have to be extraterrestrial.
To be fair, we don't know exactly how hot Jesus' torch was, but we do know this. There are bigger issues with his metal fragment because Jesus has no evidence it actually came from the object.
You didn't see anything falling, so you can't say for sure where it came from, especially here where you have farmers' fields. It could have been a piece of metal from a tractor.
So if the fragment evidence isn't proof, could that sphere shut down Jesus' phone during his critical close encounter?
These phones are pretty resilient, but if you bombard them with electromagnetic force, it's possible that you can cause the phone to get scrambled a little bit. But to do that, you need a lot of power.
Okay, so that power source is a question. NASA geologist Bob Anderson sees another problem with Jesus' story.
He said that when the object came close, the camera and cell phone stopped working. But there's no pictures of this object 20 feet from him, so there's a lot of doubt in my mind whether this is a true story.
If Jesus' account is inaccurate, what's the accurate explanation? Anderson immediately rules out planes or drones.
There's no control, there's no propellers, there's no rudders or anything on that. This object here is floating with the wind.
D'Antonio agrees. The way the object moves is the key clue to its identity.
It hasn't demonstrated any behaviors that would be considered classic UFO-type behaviors. However, Mylar balloons tend to move slower and tend to move more horizontal than vertical for a period of time. but then as it gets higher, it'll accelerate upwards. So it acts like a balloon, it looks like a balloon, maybe it is a balloon.
Our verdict? Mylar balloon. This object simply doesn't move with the speed or focus of other unexplained sphere sightings, like the Navy's Omaha incident. But Jesus, if you do any more analysis on your metal fragment, hit us up. Now, let's get creepy. The United Kingdom, with its abandoned castles and ancient cemeteries, has been called the most haunted country in the world. But of all the spooky stories, it's a 30-year-old VHS tape that recently captured the world's attention.
It's summer 1991 in Barnby Place, Bradford, UK. 15-year-old Adam Mawson has been using a camcorder to record his house when no one's home, in an effort to document some strange recent happenings. And on one of the tapes, Adam finds something frightening. Nothing seems amiss until a shadowy figure slowly begins to emerge from the chair. Look closely. It eventually rises and moves about the room, passing behind the door frame before returning and seemingly disappearing through the wall. Moments later, a second figure appears from the right and follows closely behind the other into the wall.
I was scared to death because I thought, what the hell is that? And that's when I showed my parents it, and my mum said, oh yeah, I've seen that before. I've seen it with her own eyes.
And to journalist Alexis Brooks, it sounds like a classic haunted house tale.
Barnby Place ranks among one of the most haunted places that I have ever seen. I mean, you're talking about disembodied voices, doors opening, closing on their own, and even what I would call a shadow person phenomenon.
Shadow people are described as dark silhouettes with human shapes and profiles. These shadowy creatures are sometimes interpreted as the presence of a spirit or other entity. Others believe these figures to be negative beings that can be repelled by various means, including invoking the name of Jesus.
I have seen and heard so many accounts of what we call the shadow person phenomenon. Many reports of shadow people include harassing an individual in their bedroom. So I would dare say that in addition to the more conventional haunting, we have what I would call a shadow person phenomenon going on in that home.
A figure often associated with shadow people is the Hat Man, a famous urban legend who wears a dark coat, a hat, and is unusually tall. Sometimes the figure is thought to be the devil himself.
Adam's father still lives in the house on Barnby Place and says the activity has died down since he found religion. But that only seems to confirm that perhaps something spiritual was going on. Our experts take a closer look.
First, we head to forensic video analyst Michael Primo for an authenticity check of this digitized copy.
We're not able to identify it as an actual ghost through forensic testing, but it could be the product of when the video was processed between the time that it was produced on tape to this digital version as some sort of artifact that is concealed as the object travels by, but is a CGI less likely.
So this footage probably wasn't manipulated intentionally, but how about accidentally?
These shadowy figures don't appear to be something that was introduced into the recording based on the artifacts that are present throughout its movement. And because we see these shadowy figures over several seconds in multiple instances, it's more likely something that actually happened in the video images.
So this recording itself may not have been manipulated, but we are not ready to declare this a ghost. We turn to physicist Dr. Matthew Shadagas, who suspects something shady.
What we're seeing here is this dark figure or shadow seeming to pass into the left wall and disappear, which would favor the ghost explanation. However, if you look very carefully over these few frames, there is some pixel darkening on the left that would seem to indicate that the shadow goes over the wall as we'd expect for a normal shadow being cast by someone off camera. It does not fully explain all the subtle motions we see, such as when the shape rises out of the chair, but it's the most plausible non-ghost explanation that I can come up with.
Primo disagrees and doesn't see any evidence that the shadow was created by someone off camera.
If the shadow was produced by the operator that's standing behind the camera, we would expect to see more of that cast off on the regions surrounding the doorway. But it's not produced over here on the right side of the image. These darker regions, being some sort of shadow is not really possible with the way that we don't see that information on the doorway.
So if we're ruling out shadows of someone off camera, could this truly be a ghost? Some say physics itself is all the proof you need of life after death, because the law of conservation of energy states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. We bring that theory to Dr. Shadagis.
This is a misinterpretation of what conservation of energy means. The very notion of conservation of energy comes from energy changing form. And a great example of this energy exchange occurs after we have passed away and our body decomposes. Gases and other elements will feed the worms after we've died. Therefore, we cannot use an argument like conservation of energy from physics in order to prove or disprove life after death.
So, it seems current science still can't attest to the existence of ghosts. But as of now, we can't explain this video any other way. Our verdict? This video is a bona fide case of unexplained phenomena, over 30 years running. Throughout the Cold War, U.S. government agencies stockpiled information on UFOs. Not surprisingly, so did our counterparts behind the Iron Curtain. But since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, many allegations have come out about the once secret KGB UFO files, including this next story, which might be the strangest one yet.
In 2011, a mysterious YouTube user named Ivan0135 uploads what he claims is leaked classified footage from the KGB shot between 1942 and 1969. The first video, posted on April 13th, starts with a KGB logo and censored text above and below. You can hear the audio clicking of an old film projector. Remember that. Next, we see a house and a mysterious flying saucer-shaped object hovering behind it. Switching to an aerial view, a saucer-shaped UFO is seen first from a distance and then zoomed in. But the most shocking footage is yet to come. Next, we're shown what looks like an alien autopsy being performed. Just weeks after the first video, a second, even more stunning video is released. It purports to put us face to face with an actual live alien. Notice how it blinks its huge, expressive eyes, and it moves its enormous round head and slim arms. As the camera pans from the bottom to the top of an alien's body, it's obvious it fits the descriptions of the infamous Greys, the alien culprit blamed in almost 3/4 of abduction reports. Science writer and spaceflight historian Amy Teitel says the footage was first uploaded to a YouTube channel created the same day the first video was shared.
This video led to a lot of discussion online, with people wondering if this footage was indeed real, and if so, what did that mean? One theory is that this is real video footage of the aliens who landed in the Soviet Union in the 1940s.
Teitel notes that some believe the footage may have been faked as part of an elaborate Cold War Soviet psyop designed to instill fear and paranoia in the United States. Would putting captured aliens on display strike panic in the West?
The idea was this footage was designed to scare the United States into believing that the Soviets had this alien technology. There's even a theory that the Roswell incident of 1947 was actually staged by Stalin just to create this fear and doubt within the United States.
Or could it possibly be real? Teitel says given more recent events, maybe aliens visiting Russia isn't so far-fetched after all.
There is a long history of alien encounters within the Soviet Union. The most notable event was in 1977 in Petrozavodsk. A number of eyewitnesses reported seeing an amethyst-colored jellyfish floating in the sky. The Petrozavodsk incident led to a meeting of the Soviet Ministry of Defense in Moscow, which in turn led to the creation of 2 new departments designed especially to look into UFO phenomena. They operated without interruption until 1990.
The official Soviet UFO investigators never released any definitive proof of alien contact. Could this be it? Our experts are here to get to the pravda, that means the truth.
We begin our analysis with our aviation and military expert, Tim McMillan.
In the first portion of the video, the flying saucer-shaped object certainly has some characteristics that are consistent with a blimp. It appears kind of football-shaped. We have the darker bottom with the lighter top, which is sunlight reflecting on it. But in terms of exotic maneuvers, you don't see any. And so, could this be a balloon? Could this be a blimp? Absolutely.
Next, we ask Professor of Anatomy and Anthropology, Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, to examine the figures seen in the footage.
I don't think that we're looking at real aliens. I think it's much more likely costumed children. This impression stems from the body proportions as well as the movements. The child has a fairly distinctive way of moving. The biomechanics of their body movements are dictated by their smaller mass and lack of maturity of body control. The same can be said for the movements, I think, seen here.
Finally, we take the footage to our forensic video analyst, Michael Primo. He immediately notes that the time code on the videos was embedded digitally after the fact.
Devices like these projectors didn't have time code. What's peculiar is the way that the time code is pulsing at one point in the video, and how at other points of the video there is no time code displayed. Just doesn't make any sense.
And here's the key discovery. Primo says that the film damage we see here is identical to a film damage effect available in some popular video editing software. And finally, remember the sound of that projector click? Primo says that's an important clue too.
One of the things that I detected in the tonality of the projector clicking sound, the tone or the pitch of that sound changes, which is an indication that the speed of the video was changed when it was being played back. So that prompted me to measure a sample group of pictures, and the sample produced a result of 47 frames per second. Much higher than any kind of film photography should have been digitized at, because the standard for film was only 24 frames per second back then.
Our verdict? This is likely a hoax, but we can't prove who made it or why. Perhaps it's an individual prankster. Or perhaps it's someone working for Mr. Putin to spread Russian disinformation. Either way, comrade, you didn't fool us this time. Okay, watch this. That's about as fast as I can throw a punch. How quickly could you move if your life depended on it? This next video has proved some people have nearly superhuman reflexes, fast enough to escape a treacherous trap. Check it out. But please, don't try this at home.
It's January 2015 in Gilbert, Arizona. People have gathered for a church talent show where 65-year-old Gordon Ray is getting ready to demonstrate how to set off a bear trap with a stick.
I was one of the youth leaders, and, you know, I can't sing or dance, but I said, I can do this. And so I just started out that routine with the mouse trap, but then I just worked up to the big grizzly bear trap.
But at the last minute, Gordon switches things up and tosses aside the wooden stake. Ignoring terrified shrieks from the crowd, he suddenly thrusts his hand downwards and into the jaws of the trap. He removes his hand in a split second right before the trap snaps shut. It happened so fast, I think we need to take another look in slow motion.
You can hear the people screaming in the background, but I had done the practice so many times in the barn ahead of time that I was really confident that I could beat it.
The left-handed Gordon claims he's always been naturally quick.
I'm real agile. I'd say like instead of a big bear, I'm more like a squirrel.
But journalist Aaron McCarthy says Gordon isn't alone in his feats of speed.
Bob Munden Jr. was an exhibition shooter who could unholster his Colt 45, shoot a target, and reholster his gun in .0175 seconds.
Munden is so fast, here he is in slow motion. McCarthy says there's a strange science behind fast reflexes like his.
Your brain, your spinal cord, your nervous system, and your muscles all have to work together to make movement happen, and it's almost instantaneous. When we're talking about reflexes, They're even faster because they cut the brain out of it entirely and go directly to the spinal cord within milliseconds. There are people who have super fast reflexes. For example, Pekka Luodslampi from Finland has the central nervous system condition Tourette syndrome, and he has the fastest punch on record at 0.186 seconds.
Yet some suspect Gordon's speed has to do with him being left-handed.
I think it could be the lefty or southpaw advantage that you see in sports. Some studies have actually shown that lefties are better at processing information more quickly, which allows them to master tasks like that.
Even if there is a slight lefty advantage, studies have shown human reaction time peaks at 24 years old and declines between 4 and 10 milliseconds every year after that. Amazingly, Gordon was 65 years old when he did this trick, even though he should be 160 to 400 milliseconds slower than his 25-year-old self. Let's see if our experts can figure out how he pulled it off.
We don't think Gordon was on performance-enhancing drugs, but we checked in with theoretical physicist Dr. Michio Kaku just to be sure.
Now, if he was on steroids, perhaps he would be bulked up. And I think we can also rule out amphetamines, because psychologically you think you're Superman, but the reality is you're limited by the speed at which muscles contract. That's a law of physics.
So, could being left-handed give Gordon an advantage? Dr. Ed Hope considers this theory.
Left-handed people make up 10% of the general population, but in certain elite sports make up disproportionately more. And they tend to be sports that involve one-on-one plays. People who are left-handed, their moves are more unfamiliar to most people, so they have limited time to react. For sports such as swimming or, dare I say, escaping a bear trap, there'd be no advantage in being left-handed.
So could we have a neurological condition like Pekka Luodslampi's Tourette syndrome?
We think it's the basal ganglia that causes Tourette syndrome, and some neurologists agree with Pekka that his record-breaking reaction times and speed is likely due to excitation in these areas of the brain as a result of his neurological condition. But actually, there's not enough evidence to say that in general, people with Tourette syndrome have improved motor abilities.
So then, is Gordon actually superhuman? Physicist Dr. Matthew Shadaga says, not so fast.
The total closure of the bear trap is about 5 frames. So at 30 frames per second, that means we can estimate the time it takes for the bear trap to close as being about 100 milliseconds. Then if we look at what is the maximum possible human reaction speed, we see that this actually fits.
Shadaga says Gordon's reflexes are above average, but that's likely helped by muscle memory, which, despite the misnomer, actually takes place in your brain. And there's only one way to get that.
How do you go to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. I think he's been able to shave a few milliseconds here, shave a few milliseconds there. He's right at the edge of what is physically possible.
Our verdict, naturally fast reaction time plus muscle memory. After the video went viral, Gordon received offers to do the stunt on talk shows, but he declined, promising his wife that what we saw was his final attempt. And remember, don't you go trying this at home, or there could be severe or even severed consequences. Russian mythology is filled with stories of mermaids and other sea monsters lurking beneath the water's surface. Looking at this next video, we can understand why any Russian might respond with a polite "niet" when invited for a seaside swim.
August 2018, Bering Sea, Russia. 2 local residents take a leisurely stroll on the beach when they discover something hideous and enormous. They pull out their phones and record this.
Похудел. Обалдеть.
A mysterious sea creature washed up on the eastern coast of Russia.
Now let's look at this thing. The enormous beast looks like it has a tail. It's white, and it looks like it's covered with some kind of fur hanging from the carcass. It doesn't appear to have a prominent face or eyes. It's about 20 feet long, and according to the witnesses, it smelled horrid.
Фу, он воняет.
Field researcher Ken Gerhardt says Russian legend speaks of water spirits like the Vaginoi, a slimy, bearded creature covered in scales that can pull people and animals underwater, break dams, drown crops, and wash away mills. This creature vaguely fits the description, but the Vaginoi was traditionally found in rivers and lakes, not the sea. So Gerhardt points to another theory.
A story that surfaced on the internet talks about organism 46B. And according to the accounts, there was a Russian scientific expedition that was exploring under thousands of feet of ice in Siberia when they encountered this giant, intelligent octopus-like creature that attacked their team, killing 3 of their members. Now, whatever you may think of this story, it's certainly not beyond the realm of possibility that there are giant unknown creatures that live at very great depths under the ice. For example, the colossal squid, the largest invertebrate on Earth.
The colossal squid, which can weigh over 1,000 pounds, was first discovered in 1925, living beneath the icy waters of Antarctica. And Gerhardt suggests one final theory. Perhaps this is not an aquatic creature at all, but possibly a long-lost remnant of the Ice Age.
This thing could be the remains of some ancient prehistoric Pleistocene megafaunal animal, something like a woolly mammoth, frozen in the permafrost for thousands of years.
A trend of rising temperatures has led to long extinct creatures being unearthed, and it's casting new light on prehistoric eras. In 2018, a team in Siberia unearthed mummified lion cubs that date back to the end of the Pleistocene epoch. That's right. In case you didn't know, Russia used to have lions. Let's see what our experts can unearth about this creature.
Biologist Shay Steingast throws doubt on the idea that this could be the Vaginoi, since it is known to have limbs which are out of place in the ocean.
It's said to have kind of a humanoid shape to it with possibly even legs. And that to me doesn't make sense, because the ocean, especially the Antarctic Ocean, is very cold. And water tends to actually suck body heat from you faster than air, which is why humans can become hypothermic even in really warm water.
So instead, could it be some large predatory creature from beneath the frozen caps, like organism 46B?
Organism 46B that was purportedly brought up from a scientific ice core expedition. This is very unlikely because when you core ice for composition, the holes that are drilled are only 1 inch or 2 in diameter. And we really just don't have the technology to drag up a giant sea creature from thousands of feet under the sea ice. So I would say that 46B is probably just a myth.
Biologist Floyd Hayes takes an icy plunge into the prehistoric animal theory.
This looks a lot like a hairy creature. It could potentially be a mammoth. Mammoths have melted out from permafrost in different parts of the world.
But after further observation, Hayes realizes the fuzzy exterior of this creature might not actually be hair at all. Hayes says this rotting corpse is the perfect example of something called a globster. Say what?
A globster is a large organic mass that washes up on the beach of an ocean or river or lake. Globsters have often been identified as giant octopuses and squids, but usually they wind up being the blubber of a whale. It doesn't resemble anything that is living, and it's because it is the carcass of an animal that is decomposing. The decomposing blubber of a whale has a fine shredded appearance similar to this. I'm sure that's what it is.
Our verdict? We're sold on Dr. Hayes' assessment that this is in fact the globster of a whale carcass whose rotting blubber actually creates the appearance of hair. You know what they say, the rising tide lifts all boats. And well, apparently other creatures too. We'll keep you posted on what else washes ashore. India is a land of ancient wonders. But sadly, many of its architectural marvels were either damaged or destroyed by invading barbarians. The structure in our next video survived the axe, perhaps not because of what it looks like, but what it sounds like.
It's November 2016, and Sunil Krishnan has made a pilgrimage to the ancient village of Hampi. He is there to explore the beauty and antiquity of the Vatala Temple. The temple's biggest attractions are these mysterious 56 pillars made of solid granite. that somehow produce musical notes when struck.
So I went there. Then I realized this is beyond my understanding. You heard about this pillar all your life. Finally, you get to play with it. That is an amazing experience.
Journalist Eric Grunhauser says that visitors to the ancient site have been fascinated by the musical pillars for more than 500 years.
The musical pillars of Hampi consist of 56 granite pillars, sometimes referred to as the Sa-Re-Ga-Ma pillars. Sa-Re-Ga-Ma being the Indian version of the tonal scale equivalent to a do, re, mi, fa. So the sounds emitted will change depending on which pillar you are tapping. According to legend, the musical pillars may have been created for the god Vishnu to celebrate his return, and the reincarnation of Vishnu will destroy the wicked and the unjust in this dawning of a new age.
Grundhauser says foreign invaders have long obsessed over the mystery of how these stone columns could produce such soothing music.
The Mughals are said to have charred the pillars for 3 months trying to unlock the secrets of their musical notes. The English ended up carving off 2 of the pillars just to see inside, discovering that they are just granite pillars. Many visitors to the site still have trouble explaining how the pillars could have been created to emit such unique musical tones.
Although we have examples of resonant stones in other parts of the world, there's nothing quite like Hampi's pillars in terms of historical significance. For decades, they have been the subject of numerous scientific studies, and yet they still remain an enigma. So let's see if our experts can solve this ancient riddle.
We start with forensic audio analyst Dr. Rob Maher, who has a theory as to how these pillars made of solid rock could make music.
The mechanics of this particular rock and the diameter of the pillars are that it's a flexural vibration, meaning the whole pillar itself is wiggling side to side, almost like a string. And so that's the thing that is allowing it to vibrate at a particular frequency.
Sound crazy? Well, you see examples of flexural vibration all the time, like on a guitar string or a coiled door stopper. To test his theory, Maher creates a synthetic version of a flexural vibration sound and compares it to the columns.
So I'll play the synthesized first. So it has the same characteristic pitch and the general quality to it, and so what we're hearing when the structure is struck is just these flexural vibrations, but the understanding of how they work is still emerging.
So how could a giant piece of stone be made to produce a sound the same way as a guitar string?
Some theories have said that it may be that the pillars are reconstituted granite, and each one of the pillars were purpose-made for the tones. Perhaps there's inclusions in the granite stones that subtly produce these differences in tone, but exactly what that inclusion would be and how Hindus of the 1500s figured that out, these are all still unanswered questions.
Barnhart also points out that even if it was possible for artisans from over 500 years ago to wield the technology needed, the surrounding evidence does not support that conclusion.
The creation of a cement that would be made of granite would involve heating up that granite to thousands of degrees, and there's no evidence of any kilns of that nature being able to get that hot anywhere near the temple.
And even then, the musical mystery remains.
The kind of trial and error it would take to make each one of them consistently make a different tone, it boggles the modern mind how we would go about this process. So the idea that scientists of the 1500s did this not once, but 56 times is really kind of amazing.
Okay, people, we are genuinely stumped. We don't know how these things were made, so we have to conclude the musical pillars of Hampi are the product of a lost technology, forgotten over time. Today, the pillars are cordoned off to prevent further damage to the stone instruments. So if you go, look, but don't touch. In an earlier episode, we brought you a confounding story about alleged UFOs caught on camera in Warminster, England. After investigating this footage, we came to the conclusion that it was simply too good to be true. The video must have been altered. However, a new lead came in after we aired that reminded us that things may not always be what they seem.
August 2018, Warminster, England, about 100 miles west of London. From the side of a highway, the passenger in a parked car notices something in the evening sky. Two bright orbs moving separately. At first, it looks like it might be a couple of helicopters or drones. But then, look at this. They split into 5 or 6 smaller objects. The cluster continues to fly in unison, illuminating the sky and coordinating maneuvers for a full 3 minutes. It's reminiscent of a series of UFO sightings that occurred in the area in the 1960s. These sightings, characterized at times by explosions and hissing flames in the sky, came to be known as the Warminster Thing. Could this video offer proof of the Warminster Thing's return? We considered UFOs and secret military tech, but ultimately the answer seemed to come from testing the validity of the video itself, and a suspicious edit gave one of our experts pause.
The transition out of the hill was removed from the video. I think I have to label this one a hoax.
At the time, our original analysis led us to believe that this video was doctored to deceive. But then you, our beloved viewers, got involved, and that changed everything.
When the original segment hit YouTube, some viewers claimed this wasn't faked footage after all.
This video really needed a second look at because of this new information.
So our ace video analyst, Mick West, went back to check the authenticity of the video and its suspicious edit.
I think what actually happened in this location was the cameraman simply moved the camera down, lost the shot, and then moved it back up again as they came out from behind the hill. And so they just did a little edit to remove that little bit of dead air.
Because of this, West doesn't think trickery or CGI was involved, which negates our old verdict.
Everything else about the video seems very genuine to me. The way the objects move seems very consistent.
West also X'd out other hypotheses, natural and technological.
There was a bunch of different hypotheses, one of which was a meteor shower, and you can kind of rule that out because it changes direction. Another possibility, drones that were rigged with fireworks, but you don't generally have drones with fireworks on because drones are quite small. Also, military technology was kind of ruled out because they're not going to be testing some kind of secret military technology by the side of a road where anyone can see it.
Which to West only meant one thing.
This is obviously something that isn't secret. It's something that's either is intended to be seen or they don't care if people see it.
But what other explanations could have possibly fit the bill? The answer almost flew past us, that is, until we logged onto social media.
We were contacted by a viewer who recognized what he was seeing on screen, and he suggested that what we might be looking at was actually pyrotechnic planes.
Pyrotechnic planes are aircraft that use their wide wingspan to slowly release fireworks from their wingtips. They've been used in a variety of functions, from air shows or weddings to the deployment of destruction in war zones. But if that's what we're seeing, who was the responsible party? All it took was a simple internet search of the business located in the area of the sighting.
I run a company called Airborne Pyrotechnics, and we fly a couple of Grog motor gliders with pyrotechnics and LEDs. And this is my son, Tom. He's my second pilot.
Airborne Pyrotechnics is run by Tim and Tom Dews, who have flown all over the world. And it's not the first time one of their displays has been mistaken for a UFO. They even have a warning on their website for that very reason.
It's funny, you know, we can do a really nice display and put half a dozen pictures up and get 50 views, and somebody takes a shaky, wobbly video of us from 10 miles away, and you can't even make out what it is, says the word UFO, and it gets thousands, hundreds of thousands of views. I just can't understand it.
Our new verdict? You guessed it, airborne pyrotechnics.
As a novelist accustomed to borrowing the grammar of reality and bending it until it confesses something truer than fact, I open this story where the proof is out there itself always opens. Not with certainty but with an object suspended between belief and denial. a silver-white orb hovering over a nameless stretch of desert highway at dawn, the kind of image that looks too simple to be staged and too strange to be ignored. And it is this image that draws our narrator, a methodical researcher named Daniel Cross, into a labyrinth of archival footage, eyewitness accounts, and classified whispers that seem to echo across decades. Because Daniel is not a believer in the religious sense nor a skeptic in the dismissive sense, he is something more dangerous, a man convinced that truth leaves patterns even when it hides. And as he studies the orbed footage frame by frame, he notices how the light refracts unnaturally, not scattering like glare or lens flare but compressing inward as if the object is swallowing illumination itself, a detail that mirrors a declassified Soviet report he once skimmed during a fellowship in Prague, a report that spoke of self-contained luminosity observed above a Siberian crash site in 1968. And this coincidence gnaws at him as he begins to structure the investigation that will become the spine of this narrative, an investigation that does not aim to prove extraterrestrial visitation outright but instead to examine the debris left behind by unexplained encounters, literal fragments of metal pulled from fields and forests, metaphorical fragments of memory carried by witnesses whose lives were quietly split into before and after, and institutional fragments, those shredded documents and redacted memos that hint at an intelligence community far more interested in managing perception than in revealing answers. And Daniel understands early on that the proof is out there is less a promise than a challenge. Because proof in this realm behaves like a trickster, appearing only long enough to provoke obsession before dissolving into ambiguity, which is why he starts with crash debris, the most tangible residue of any alleged UFO encounter, traveling first to a small Midwestern town where farmers still speak in hushed tones about the night a thunderless explosion lit the sky and scattered strange alloys across their cornfields, alloys that were swiftly collected by men who identified themselves only with clipped accents and unmarked vehicles. And here Daniel interviews an aging mechanic who claims to have pocketed a sliver of the material, describing it as lighter than aluminum yet resistant to cutting, a claim that sounds familiar to anyone versed in Roswell lore. Yet Daniel's trained ear detects something different in the man's voice, not excitement but regret, as if holding on to that fragment brought not fame but decades of quiet fear, fear that resurfaces as Daniel connects this testimony to metallurgical analyses referenced in Cold War intelligence exchanges, documents suggesting that both the CIA and the KGB quietly traded data on anomalous materials even while publicly denying the phenomenon. And this is where the story's title truly begins to breathe, because KGB UFOs is not merely a sensational phrase but a doorway into a parallel history of obsession, one in which Soviet scientists, driven by ideological rivalry and genuine curiosity, chased the same phantoms as their American counterparts, sometimes cooperating in secret, sometimes sabotaging each other's efforts. And Daniel's research leads him to the widow of a former KGB archivist who recalls her husband coming home shaken after cataloging photographs of a crash site in Kazakhstan. Photographs that showed scorched earth arranged in geometric patterns inconsistent with any known aircraft impact. And as Daniel listens, he feels the familiar tension that defines The Proof Is Out There as a series, the tension between anecdote and analysis, because every story carries the risk of embellishment, yet patterns begin to emerge when stories align across borders and decades, patterns like the recurring appearance of orbs prior to crashes, or the way debris is almost always confiscated under the banner of national security, leaving civilians with only memories and rumors. And Daniel frames these observations not as conclusions but as questions, inviting the reader to inhabit the uncertainty rather than flee from it. And this narrative choice mirrors the show's own discipline, its refusal to declare aliens were experimental aircraft or natural phenomena might suffice, even as it acknowledges the limits of conventional explanations. And it is in this liminal space that creativity finds room to operate. Because Daniel begins to imagine the orb not as a craft in the traditional sense but as a probe, a sensor, or perhaps a byproduct of technologies we do not yet understand. A speculation inspired by a physicist he interviews who suggests that some UFO sightings could be manifestations of energy systems interacting with our atmosphere, an idea that would explain both the luminous orbs and the lack of conventional wreckage in many cases. Yet this hypothesis falters when confronted with physical debris, twisted metals and isotopic anomalies that resist easy categorization. and so the narrative circles back to the human element, to the witnesses whose credibility is often dismissed but whose consistency becomes harder to ignore when placed side by side, like the airline pilot who describes a near-miss with an orb that executed right-angle turns at impossible speeds, or the Soviet radar operator whose logs recorded objects entering restricted airspace and then vanishing without trace, and Daniel treats these accounts with cautious respect, aware that perception is fallible but also aware that mass delusion rarely organizes itself with such precision, and as the first part of this novel-length exploration draws toward its close, Daniel stands in an archive room surrounded by boxes labeled with dates and code names, realizing that the real crash may not be of alien origin at all but of narrative control, because every government involved seems to have collided with something it could neither explain nor fully conceal, scattering fragments of truth across the cultural landscape where shows like The Proof is out there now attempt to reassemble them, and the reader is left not with an answer but with a charged silence, the sense that the orb hovering over that desert highway is still there, waiting, as patient as it is indifferent, for us to decide whether we will keep looking upward or avert our eyes once more, and so I ask you now, at the threshold of this investigation. Daniel Cross begins the second phase of his inquiry with a quiet realization that unsettles him more than any orb footage ever could, namely that patterns do not merely exist in the data but in the reactions to the data. And so part 2 unfolds not with a new sighting but with an examination of how institutions respond when confronted with the unexplained. Because The Proof is out there has always insisted that mystery is shaped as much by denial and deflection as by evidence itself, and Daniel understands that to follow the trail of UFO phenomena he must study the choreography of secrecy, the reflexive tightening of language, the sudden appearance of weather balloons, experimental tests, or misidentified celestial bodies whenever public curiosity grows too loud, and it is with this mindset that he travels to Washington, D.C., where he gains access to a retired intelligence analyst named Margaret Hale, a woman whose career spanned the final decades of the Cold War and whose memory remains sharp enough to cut through euphemism, and she tells Daniel that during her years in the Pentagon, UFO reports were never dismissed outright in internal briefings, they were categorized, cross-referenced, and above all contained, because uncertainty was seen as a strategic vulnerability, a weakness that adversaries could exploit. And this perspective reframes everything Daniel thought he knew, because it suggests that governments may not hide UFOs because they know too much, but because they know too little, and ignorance at that scale is far more terrifying than revelation. And Margaret recounts an incident from 1979 when radar installations along the northern border tracked multiple fast-moving objects performing synchronized maneuvers, prompting a brief escalation protocol before the contacts vanished. An event that was officially attributed to atmospheric anomalies but privately discussed as unknowns with intent unclear, a phrase that lingers in Daniel's mind as he considers how language itself becomes a kind of debris field, scattered fragments of meaning left behind by encounters with the inexplicable, and from Washington he moves to Moscow, not physically but through translated documents and recorded interviews archived by independent researchers after the fall of the Soviet Union. And here the narrative deepens into the realm hinted at by the title's reference to KGB UFOs, because Daniel discovers that the Soviet approach to unidentified aerial phenomena was at once more blunt and more paranoid than its American counterpart, driven by a worldview that interpreted every anomaly through the lens of espionage and sabotage. And yet even within this rigid framework there were moments of genuine wonder, as evidenced by a 1982 internal memo describing luminous spheres observed above a missile testing range. Spheres that appeared to monitor launches before dispersing without interference, and Daniel notes how eerily this mirrors modern pilot encounters reported decades later, suggesting continuity rather than coincidence, and this continuity becomes the emotional core of Part 2, because it implies that whatever these phenomena represent, they are not bound by political systems or technological eras, instead persisting as a constant variable in human history, and Daniel's investigation takes a more personal turn when he interviews Alexei Morozov, the son of a former KGB field officer who was stationed near a remote crash site in the Ural Mountains, and Alexei describes his father as a pragmatic man, skeptical of mysticism, yet forever changed after witnessing wreckage that did not burn like conventional aircraft debris, metal folded inward as if crushed by invisible pressure rather than impact, and Daniel listens closely to Alexei's account of his father's nightmares, dreams filled with humming sounds and shifting lights, and he recognizes a familiar motif, the psychological residue left behind by close encounters, which the proof is out there often highlights as an overlooked form of evidence, not proof of extraterrestrial origin but proof of human disruption, and this disruption extends beyond individuals to entire systems. Because Daniel uncovers evidence that both NATO and Warsaw Pact nations quietly adjusted air defense protocols in response to unidentified objects, despite publicly denying their significance, and this duplicity fascinates him, as it suggests a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of vulnerability, a tacit agreement that some questions were better left unanswered in public discourse, and yet here we are decades later, sifting through the remnants of those decisions like archaeologists of secrecy, and Daniel reflects on how modern disclosure debates echo Cold War anxieties, with governments releasing just enough information to appear transparent while retaining plausible deniability, and he weaves this reflection into a broader meditation on proof itself, arguing that proof in the UFO context is often misconstrued as a single decisive artifact when in reality it is cumulative, an accretion of testimonies, documents, and anomalies that resist simplification, and this idea crystallizes during a visit to a university lab where scientists analyze alleged crash debris submitted by civilians. And Daniel observes the careful neutrality of the researchers as they explain isotopic ratios and crystalline structures, never claiming extraterrestrial origin yet admitting when samples defy easy classification. And this cautious honesty strikes Daniel as more compelling than sensational claims, because it mirrors the ethos of the proof is out there, which thrives on disciplined curiosity rather than blind belief. And as Part 2 progresses, the narrative tension builds around the question of intent, not just what these objects are but why they appear, because both American and Soviet documents occasionally speculate about surveillance, a hypothesis that unsettles Daniel when he considers the historical context, the nuclear arms race, the brinkmanship that brought humanity repeatedly to the edge of annihilation, and he wonders whether UFO phenomena might be less interested in us as individuals and more concerned with our capacity for self-destruction. A speculation that feels less like science fiction and more like an uncomfortable mirror held up to human history. And this line of thought culminates in Daniel's examination of a declassified KGB study that analyzed UFO sightings near nuclear facilities, concluding that their frequency was statistically significant rather than random, a conclusion buried under layers of bureaucratic caution but nonetheless striking, and Daniel juxtaposes this with similar findings from American sources, creating a parallel narrative that transcends ideology, and the effect is sobering, because it suggests that in the grand theater of geopolitics, humanity may not be the sole audience, and as the part draws toward its end, Daniel confronts his own biases, acknowledging that the deeper he digs the less certain he becomes, and yet this uncertainty does not paralyze him, it sharpens his resolve, because he now understands that the true subject of this investigation is not UFOs themselves but the human response to the unknown, our instinct to categorize, control, and conceal, and as he closes his notebook at the end of Part 2, the reader is left with the image of two superpowers staring at the same inexplicable lights in the sky, each convinced that the other must know more, while the truth hovers silently above them, indifferent to flags and borders. And so I ask you, having gone deeper into the shadows of secrecy and strategy, Daniel Cross enters the third movement of his investigation with a sense that the ground beneath the story has subtly shifted, because if Part 1 was about fragments and Part 2 about secrecy, then Part 3 must confront the most unstable terrain of all, interpretation, the fragile bridge between raw data and human meaning, and he realizes that this is where the proof is out there becomes most controversial, not because it presents wild claims but because it exposes how easily certainty collapses when competing explanations coexist. And so this part opens with Daniel reviewing a montage of orb sightings captured across different decades, continents, and recording technologies, from grainy VHS tapes to crisp digital sensors, noting how skeptics often argue that improved camera quality should reduce UFO reports while believers counter that better sensors merely reveal what was always there. And Daniel resists both simplifications, choosing instead to focus on motion behavior, The sudden accelerations, the hovering defiance of aerodynamics, the recurring silence that accompanies many sightings. And as he catalogues these traits, he begins to see them not as proof of alien craft but as signatures of something that does not conform to our established categories, a distinction that matters deeply to him because categories, once fixed, tend to imprison thought rather than liberate it, and this realization pushes Daniel toward the scientific frontier of the phenomenon, where physicists, aerospace engineers, and atmospheric researchers cautiously overlap, sometimes collaborating, sometimes contradicting each other, all bound by a shared reluctance to speculate beyond evidence, and yet speculation seeps in through the cracks regardless, because anomalies demand narrative just as strongly as they demand measurement, and Daniel attends a closed-door symposium where experts debate the possibility that some UFOs might be plasma-based phenomena, self-organizing energy structures, influenced by electromagnetic fields, an idea that could explain luminous orbs and erratic motion without invoking advanced technology, and Daniel listens carefully as proponents cite laboratory experiments demonstrating plasma stability under certain conditions, while critics argue that such phenomena could not persist long enough or travel with apparent intent. And this clash fascinates him because it mirrors the broader cultural debate, rational explanation versus experiential testimony, neither fully sufficient on its own. And as the discussion unfolds, Daniel realizes that the proof is out there operates precisely in this tension, offering viewers not answers but frameworks for thinking. And it is within one such framework that Daniel begins to reassess crash debris, because if some UFOs are not solid craft but energy manifestations, then what exactly is crashing? And this question leads him back to the debris cases that stubbornly refuse dematerialization, those twisted alloys and isotopic irregularities that anchor the phenomenon in physical reality, and he travels next to a remote desert testing range where alleged debris was recovered after a mid-air explosion witnessed by multiple radar systems, an incident officially attributed to a classified drone malfunction, yet Daniel uncovers discrepancies in the timeline, moments where radar tracks show objects converging before the explosion, suggesting interaction rather than accident, and as he interviews a retired radar technician, the man describes seeing returns that moved like nothing he had trained for, not ballistic, not aerodynamic, but deliberate, as if responding to observation itself. And Daniel feels a chill at this phrasing because it echoes accounts from pilots and sailors who felt observed by UFOs, a subjective sensation that nonetheless recurs with uncanny consistency, and he begins to wonder whether intent, so often dismissed as anthropomorphic projection, might be a clue rather than a distraction, not necessarily intent in the conscious sense but responsiveness, an interaction loop between observer and phenomenon, and this idea finds resonance in declassified KGB psychological studies. Daniel reviews documents that explored the mental effects of repeated UFO exposure on military personnel, noting heightened anxiety, sleep disturbances, and a persistent sense of surveillance, effects that Soviet researchers struggled to explain within existing models, and Daniel juxtaposes these findings with modern studies on pilot encounters released by Western defense departments, discovering near identical symptom patterns, and the implication unsettles him, because it suggests that beyond hardware and geopolitics lies a human cost that transcends ideology, a quiet erosion of certainty experienced by those closest to the unknown. And as Daniel weaves these threads together, the narrative of Part 3 deepens into a meditation on perception itself, because if UFO phenomena interact with observers, then observation is not passive but participatory, a concept borrowed from quantum mechanics, but here applied metaphorically to cultural experience. And Daniel explores how media framing shapes sightings, how once an image of an orb enters public consciousness it becomes a lens through which future anomalies are interpreted, amplifying some details while muting others, and he is careful not to dismiss this as mere mass suggestion, instead treating it as a feedback system where culture and phenomenon co-evolve, each influencing how the other is perceived and recorded, and this perspective allows Daniel to reinterpret historical waves of sightings not as sudden invasions or hoaxes but as moments where technology, anxiety, and attention align, creating conditions ripe for anomaly recognition. And he illustrates this by analyzing Cold War spikes in UFO reports alongside periods of heightened nuclear tension, suggesting that when humanity stands closest to self-annihilation it becomes more attuned to signs of the unknown, a hypothesis that does not reduce UFOs to psychology but situates psychology as part of the equation, and as Part 3 progresses Daniel confronts a criticism often leveled at the proof is out there, namely that it thrives on ambiguity without offering closure, and he counters this internally by redefining closure not as resolution but as comprehension, the ability to hold multiple explanations without collapsing into cynicism or fanaticism, and he demonstrates this approach during a field investigation of a recent orb sighting captured by a commercial drone operator, where skeptics quickly labeled the footage as lens flare while believers proclaimed advanced technology, and Daniel methodically reconstructs the conditions, analyzing sun angle, camera artifacts, and environmental factors, ultimately concluding that while lens flare explains some aspects, others remain unresolved, and he presents this conclusion not as failure but as honesty, arguing that unresolved does not mean unexplainable, only not yet explained, and this distinction becomes the philosophical anchor of Part 3, because it preserves curiosity without surrendering rigor, and the narrative briefly shifts inward as Daniel reflects on his own emotional journey, acknowledging moments of doubt where the sheer volume of contradictory data threatens to overwhelm him, and he admits to a quiet fear that perhaps there is nothing extraordinary at the core of all this, only a mosaic of misinterpretations. Yet even this possibility does not diminish the story's significance, because the patterns of belief, denial, and obsession reveal as much about humanity as any extraterrestrial hypothesis ever could, and Daniel recognizes that in chasing proof he is also chasing self-understanding, an insight that resonates with the ethos of the proof is out there, which often turns the investigative lens back onto the investigators themselves. And as the part nears its conclusion, Daniel uncovers a newly declassified set of joint Cold War communications between Soviet and American scientists proposing a shared research initiative on unidentified aerial phenomena, an initiative that was quietly abandoned amid political distrust, and this lost opportunity haunts him, symbolizing a path not taken where cooperation might have replaced secrecy, and he imagines how history might have unfolded differently had humanity chosen collective inquiry over competitive concealment, and the image of orbs hovering over missile silos takes on a new metaphorical weight, representing not just unknown observers but the possibility of an external mirror reflecting our divisions back at us, and as Daniel closes Part 3 he stands metaphorically at a crossroads, aware that future chapters must grapple not only with evidence and explanation but with implication, what it would mean if some portion of the phenomenon truly lies beyond current human understanding, and whether we are prepared to integrate such knowledge without fracturing socially or psychologically. And the reader is left suspended in that question, hovering like the orbs themselves between skepticism and wonder, and so I ask you, having journeyed deeper into perception, science, and interpretation. Daniel Cross approaches the fourth stage of his investigation with a sharpened awareness that every unexplained phenomenon carries a shadow history of people whose lives were bent around it, and if earlier parts traced evidence, secrecy, and interpretation, then Part 4 descends deliberately into testimony, the unstable yet indispensable human archive that the proof is out there has always treated with cautious seriousness, because Daniel now understands that witnesses are not merely sources of information but living instruments through which the unknown resonates, altered by fear, awe, ridicule, and time, and this realization guides him toward a series of interviews that form the emotional backbone of this part, beginning with a former air traffic controller named Thomas Reed, who recounts a night in the early 1990s when multiple commercial flights reported luminous orbs pacing their aircraft, maintaining formation without emitting transponder signals, and Daniel listens as Thomas describes the moment when radar confirmed visual reports, a convergence that stripped away the usual comfort of misidentification, because what is seen and what is tracked rarely align so perfectly. And Thomas's voice trembles not with excitement but with something closer to grief, because that night marked the end of his unshakable faith in procedural certainty, a faith replaced by the knowledge that the sky was not as predictable as he had been trained to believe, and Daniel recognizes this psychological rupture as a recurring motif, the shattering of professional identity that often follows close encounters, and he contextualizes Thomas's story within broader FAA archives, noting how similar incidents were quietly filed under ambiguous categories, neither confirmed nor denied, creating a bureaucratic limbo that mirrors the existential limbo experienced by the witnesses themselves. And from here Daniel's inquiry widens geographically and culturally, because he becomes increasingly convinced that testimony must be examined comparatively rather than individually, and so he turns to South America, where a cluster of orb sightings over military installations in the late 1970s generated hundreds of reports from soldiers, technicians, and civilians alike. And Daniel studies translated transcripts of interviews conducted by local researchers, discovering with fascination that despite vast cultural differences, the language used to describe the phenomena converges on similar metaphors: floating suns, intelligent lights, silent watchers, and this convergence troubles simplistic explanations rooted solely in folklore or media influence, suggesting instead that certain experiential qualities impose themselves on human perception regardless of context. And Daniel weaves these accounts together with Cold War-era Soviet testimonies, some of which only surfaced after the collapse of the USSR, revealing that KGB officers and scientists privately grappled with the same vocabulary of inadequacy, repeatedly noting in reports that conventional terminology failed to capture what was observed, and this linguistic failure becomes a subtle but powerful theme in Part 4, because it highlights how language itself fractures when confronted with the unfamiliar, leaving witnesses to improvise descriptions that hover between poetry and technical jargon. And Daniel argues internally that this improvisation is not evidence of fabrication but of cognitive strain, the mind reaching beyond its established categories, and this insight leads him to consult cognitive psychologists who specialize in trauma and anomalous experience, experts who explain how intense, unexpected events can imprint memory with extraordinary clarity while simultaneously distorting temporal perception, causing witnesses to report moments that feel elongated or compressed, a phenomenon frequently mentioned in UFO encounters. And Daniel notes how this aligns with pilot reports of missing time or distorted sequence, observations that skeptics often ridicule but which psychologists recognize as common responses to high-stress anomalies. And rather than using this to debunk the phenomenon, Daniel treats it as an additional layer of data, evidence not of alien intervention but of human vulnerability in the face of the unknown. And this perspective allows him to reframe ridicule itself as part of the phenomenon's ecosystem, a social defense mechanism designed to protect collective normalcy by isolating those who challenge it. And he reflects on how the proof is out there often positions witnesses not as heroes or fools but as reluctant participants in a narrative they did not choose, a framing that resonates deeply as Daniel interviews a woman named Elena Petrovna, whose father served as a Soviet engineer at a radar facility near the Black Sea. And Elena recounts her father's quiet transformation after repeated encounters with unidentified objects that disrupted radar operations, describing how he became withdrawn, obsessively documenting mundane details as if clinging to normalcy. And Daniel senses that for many witnesses the true aftermath of an encounter is not the sighting itself but the long-term erosion of trust in institutions that deny what they experienced, trust in peers who dismiss them, and even trust in their own perception. And this erosion, Daniel realizes, constitutes a kind of psychological debris field, invisible but pervasive, scattered across decades and continents. And as he synthesizes these testimonies, he becomes acutely aware of a paradox at the heart of witness evidence, because while individual accounts are fragile and easily challenged, their collective weight forms patterns that resist dismissal, patterns of behavior, emotion, and consequence that repeat with uncanny consistency. And Daniel carefully avoids declaring these patterns as proof of extraterrestrial origin, instead presenting them as proof of encounters with something that destabilizes existing frameworks, whatever its ultimate explanation may be. And this careful distinction reflects the ethos of the proof is out there, which often emphasizes that acknowledging mystery does not require surrendering to fantasy. And as Part 4 progresses, Daniel introduces a new layer of analysis by examining how governments selectively amplify or suppress witness testimony depending on strategic context, citing cases where sightings near sensitive installations were aggressively silenced while similar reports in civilian areas were allowed to circulate as curiosities. and this selective management reinforces his growing suspicion that the phenomenon's greatest impact lies not in what it is but in how power structures respond to it, shaping public discourse to maintain authority over uncertainty. And he juxtaposes this with moments of accidental transparency, leaks and miscommunications that briefly exposed raw testimony before it could be sanitized, moments that often fueled public fascination and conspiracy theories alike. And Daniel reflects on how secrecy breeds speculation just as surely as light attracts moths, a dynamic that complicates any attempt at rational discussion. And in a particularly striking passage he analyzes a cluster of KGB interrogation transcripts where soldiers were questioned not about what they saw but about how they felt, revealing an institutional awareness that emotion itself constituted a variable worth monitoring, an acknowledgement that fear, awe, and confusion could ripple through units and compromise discipline, and Daniel finds this deeply telling, because it suggests that even hardened security apparatuses recognized the destabilizing potential of the unknown. And as he draws these threads together, the narrative of Part 4 shifts toward a more introspective register, with Daniel confronting his own relationship to testimony, questioning whether his empathy might bias his analysis, and he admits to moments where a witness's quiet sincerity disarms his skepticism more effectively than any physical evidence ever could. And this admission does not weaken his inquiry but strengthens it, because it acknowledges the human dimension that purely technical analyses often ignore. And Daniel frames this as an ethical choice, arguing implicitly that investigations into UFO phenomena must account for human experience without exploiting it, a balance that The Proof Is Out There strives to maintain. And as the part nears its end, Daniel attends a small support meeting of individuals who have shared anomalous encounters, observing how they exchange stories not to convince outsiders but to reassure one another that they are not alone. And this scene crystallizes the central insight of Part 4, that regardless of origin, UFO phenomena function as social events, creating communities of belief, skepticism, and shared uncertainty. And Daniel recognizes that these communities represent both a strength and a vulnerability, capable of fostering resilience or spiraling into paranoia depending on how uncertainty is managed. And he ends the part with a haunting image of countless unrecorded testimonies fading with time, stories never archived, never analyzed, leaving behind only subtle changes in behavior and belief. And he wonders how many fragments of the truth have already been lost not through deliberate suppression but through neglect, a realization that adds urgency to his ongoing work. And so, standing amid the echoes of voices that history almost erased, I ask you now. Daniel Cross enters Part 5 with a growing conviction that time itself is an overlooked variable in the UFO phenomenon, not merely as a historical backdrop but as an active pressure shaping how encounters are recorded, remembered, distorted, and eventually forgotten. And he realizes that The Proof Is Out There, at its most effective, treats time not as a straight line but as a looping current where past and present constantly revise one another. And so this part unfolds as an excavation across decades, a deliberate attempt to trace how identical patterns reappear under different technological skins, because Daniel has begun to suspect that the phenomenon adapts less than humanity does, remaining curiously consistent while our explanations mutate. And this suspicion draws him back to archival footage from the 1950s, black and white films of luminous objects pacing military aircraft, footage long dismissed as optical illusions or early jet misidentifications. Yet when Daniel overlays these films with modern infrared recordings, he is struck by how similar the movement profiles appear, the same sudden accelerations, the same refusal to follow predictable arcs. And he wonders aloud in his notes whether progress in technology has truly brought us closer to understanding or has merely given us sharper instruments with which to document our confusion. And this question becomes the philosophical spine of Part 5. Because Daniel begins to interrogate the assumption that knowledge naturally accumulates over time, proposing instead that certain mysteries resist linear progress, resetting themselves with each generation as cultural context shifts. And this resistance becomes evident when he interviews a young aerospace engineer who describes encountering an orb during a routine test flight, only to discover that the language used to report such encounters remains nearly identical to reports written by pilots half a century earlier, full of careful qualifiers and defensive phrasing designed to preempt ridicule. And Daniel notes how this continuity of caution suggests that institutional stigma has outlived multiple technological revolutions, embedding itself deeply into professional culture. And from here the narrative widens to examine how disclosure itself has evolved, because while Cold War secrecy relied on classification and denial, the modern era employs overload, releasing vast quantities of ambiguous data that blur rather than clarify, and Daniel examines recent Pentagon briefings where UFOs are rebranded as UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, a semantic shift that ostensibly signals seriousness but also subtly distances the subject from its cultural baggage. And he analyzes this move as both progress and deflection. Progress in that it legitimizes investigation, deflection in that it reframes mystery in technocratic language that dampens public imagination. And Daniel is careful not to dismiss this strategy outright, recognizing that responsible inquiry demands precision, yet he questions whether excessive restraint risks sterilizing the very curiosity that drives discovery. And this tension between openness and control mirrors the broader societal struggle to integrate uncertainty without destabilization. And it is within this context that Daniel turns to one of the most controversial aspects of the phenomenon: crash retrieval programs, because debris represents a temporal paradox, material evidence frozen in time, extracted from moments that should not exist according to official narratives. And Daniel revisits earlier debris cases with a new temporal lens, examining how materials recovered decades ago were analyzed using the limited tools of their era, often yielding inconclusive results that may deserve reevaluation with modern techniques. And he visits a private lab where researchers are reanalyzing legacy samples, not claiming extraterrestrial origin but openly acknowledging anomalous properties. And Daniel watches as spectrographic data reveals isotopic ratios inconsistent with known manufacturing processes from the alleged time of recovery, a finding that does not scream alien but whispers unfamiliar. And he reflects on how whispers are often more unsettling than shouts, because they linger, and this leads him into a meditation on generational inheritance, how unanswered questions are passed down not as clear problems to be solved but as half-remembered anxieties, shaping scientific priorities and cultural myths alike. And Daniel draws a parallel between UFO lore and other unresolved historical enigmas, arguing that societies tend to mythologize what they cannot integrate, transforming gaps in knowledge into stories that oscillate between ridicule and reverence. And this oscillation becomes particularly visible when he examines public reaction to newly released footage, noting how social media accelerates polarization, collapsing nuanced debate into camps of belief and disbelief. And Daniel worries that this dynamic may ultimately hinder serious inquiry by forcing premature conclusions, and he contrasts this with the slower, more contemplative pace of earlier investigations, which, while hampered by secrecy, allowed anomalies to gestate intellectually before being thrust into the public arena. And this comparison is not nostalgic but cautionary, because Daniel recognizes that speed itself can become an enemy of understanding. And as Part 5 deepens, Daniel confronts a more personal temporal reckoning, reflecting on how his own views have evolved since beginning the project, acknowledging that what once felt like an external mystery now feels increasingly internal, a test of patience, humility, and tolerance for ambiguity. And he admits that there are moments when the sheer persistence of the phenomenon exhausts him, when the repetition of unresolved cases feels less like intrigue and more like a closed loop. Yet it is precisely this persistence that convinces him something substantive lies beneath, because hoaxes, delusions, and misinterpretations tend to burn out quickly, while this phenomenon endures, adapting to new eras without losing its core characteristics. And this endurance becomes the quiet argument of Part 5, that longevity itself may be a form of evidence, not evidence of aliens, but evidence that the question we are asking has not yet been properly framed. And Daniel proposes that humanity may be approaching the phenomenon from the wrong temporal angle, treating it as an event-based mystery rather than a long-term interaction, something that unfolds slowly, intersecting with our technological milestones without being defined by them. And this idea gains weight when Daniel studies indigenous accounts of sky beings and luminous objects recorded long before modern aviation, accounts that describe behavior eerily similar to contemporary sightings. And while he is careful not to collapse these narratives into literal equivalents, He argues that dismissing them outright risks ignoring a deep historical continuity of anomalous experience. And he frames this continuity not as proof of ancient astronauts but as a reminder that unexplained aerial phenomena did not begin with radar, only with documentation. And as Part 5 approaches its conclusion, Daniel synthesizes these temporal threads into a sobering reflection that perhaps the greatest obstacle to understanding is our impatience, our desire for definitive answers within a single lifetime or funding cycle, and he contrasts this with the phenomenon's apparent indifference to human schedules, appearing and disappearing on its own terms, leaving behind just enough evidence to provoke inquiry but never enough to conclude it decisively, and this asymmetry unsettles him, because it suggests a mismatch between human epistemology and the nature of the unknown, and he wonders whether future generations will look back on our current debates as primitive, or whether they will inherit the same questions, reframed but unresolved. And the final image of Part 5 lingers on this uncertainty, Daniel standing in an archive where analog film reels sit beside digital servers, each recording luminous objects that refuse to age, and he realizes that time, which erodes so much else, seems strangely ineffective here, as if the phenomenon exists slightly out of phase with human history, close enough to be seen but never close enough to be grasped. And so, at the end of this meditation on persistence and patience, I turn to you and ask. Daniel Cross begins Part 6 with the uneasy sense that the investigation is no longer merely tracking phenomena but is being subtly tracked in return, not in any conspiratorial sense but through the quiet feedback loops that emerge whenever inquiry brushes against sensitive thresholds, and this awareness draws him toward the modern surveillance landscape, because he realizes that any contemporary discussion of unidentified objects in the sky must grapple with the paradox of unprecedented observation, a world saturated with satellites, sensors, drones, and cameras, yet still producing mysteries that resist resolution, and the proof is out there has often leaned into this paradox, questioning how so much can be seen and still so little understood, and Daniel frames this part around that contradiction, asking how a civilization that watches itself constantly can remain blind to certain anomalies, and his answer unfolds slowly, through layers of technical, institutional, and psychological filtering, beginning with an examination of sensor hierarchies, the way raw data is processed, prioritized, and discarded before it ever reaches human eyes. And Daniel interviews a former defense contractor who explains that most anomalous readings are never investigated because they fall outside predefined threat models, meaning that objects which do not behave like known adversarial technologies are often categorized as noise rather than novelty, and this insight reframes the UFO debate in unsettling ways, suggesting that invisibility can be engineered not through secrecy but through irrelevance, by designing systems that literally cannot recognize what they were not built to detect. And Daniel reflects on how this technological myopia mirrors cognitive bias, the human tendency to ignore data that does not fit existing frameworks, and he sees in this mirror a recurring theme from earlier parts. That mystery persists not because it is hidden but because it is misfiled, and this idea gains weight as he studies modern UAP task force reports, noting how often encounters are attributed to sensor glitches without definitive proof of malfunction, a conclusion that satisfies procedural requirements while leaving core questions untouched. And Daniel is careful not to accuse these institutions of bad faith, instead portraying them as systems optimized for stability rather than curiosity, systems that treat ambiguity as risk, and this framing allows him to explore a more subtle form of suppression, one rooted not in cover-up but in design philosophy, and from here the narrative turns to artificial intelligence, because Daniel recognizes that machine learning systems are increasingly responsible for parsing the skies, and he questions how these systems interpret anomalies, discovering through interviews with developers that AI models are trained on known object profiles, meaning that truly novel phenomena may be misclassified or ignored entirely. And this realization unsettles Daniel deeply, because it suggests that as observation becomes more automated, the window for recognizing the unknown may actually narrow, not widen. And he weaves this concern into a broader meditation on the future of proof, asking whether evidence that cannot be easily categorized will simply vanish into algorithmic blind spots. And he contrasts this with the raw human encounters of earlier decades, when witnesses at least had the authority of their own senses. however flawed, and Daniel does not romanticize the past, acknowledging the errors and hoaxes that flourished in less monitored eras. But he insists that there was a certain openness to anomaly that modern systems lack, an openness born of not yet knowing what to ignore, and this tension between human perception and machine filtering becomes the intellectual engine of Part 6, because it forces Daniel to confront a provocative possibility, that the phenomenon may not be adapting to us, but that we are adapting away from it, gradually constructing layers of interpretation that insulate us from direct encounter, and this idea gains narrative momentum when Daniel examines a recent incident involving multiple military sensors detecting an object that human observers never visually confirmed, an inversion of classic UFO cases where eyewitnesses outpaced instruments, and the incident ends inconclusively, classified as unresolved, and Daniel notes how such cases generate little public interest because they lack compelling imagery, highlighting how cultural fascination depends as much on narrative as on data, and he uses this observation to critique both media sensationalism and excessive skepticism, arguing that each distorts inquiry in different ways, sensationalism by leaping to conclusions, skepticism by prematurely closing them, and Daniel positions the proof is out there as an imperfect but necessary counterbalance, a space where unresolved cases are allowed to remain unresolved without being trivialized. And as Part 6 progresses, Daniel revisits the Cold War material with fresh eyes, comparing Soviet-era radar blind spots with modern algorithmic ones, and he is struck by how different systems produce similar outcomes, consistent pockets of uncertainty where unexplained objects appear and vanish, and he speculates that these pockets may not be random but emergent properties of observation itself, places where complexity overwhelms classification. And this speculation leads him to consult systems theorists who describe how complex systems inevitably generate anomalies that cannot be fully predicted or controlled, and Daniel finds this framework compelling because it reframes UFO phenomena not as intrusions into order but as expressions of its limits, and he begins to articulate a theory that the phenomenon persists because it occupies the boundary conditions of our knowledge systems, always just outside what can be comfortably explained. And this theory does not require extraterrestrial intelligence to function, yet it does not exclude it either, maintaining the disciplined openness that has guided his inquiry from the beginning, and this balance becomes increasingly difficult to sustain as Daniel encounters resistance from colleagues who urge him to simplify his conclusions for broader appeal, to choose a side, belief or debunking. And Daniel resists this pressure, recognizing it as another form of institutional filtering, one that favors certainty over accuracy, and he reflects on how audiences often demand answers not because they are ready for them but because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and this discomfort, he argues, is precisely what the phenomenon exploits or embodies, depending on interpretation, and in a particularly introspective passage Daniel admits that he too longs for closure, that the endless circling of questions can feel like intellectual purgatory. Yet he recognizes that premature closure would betray the integrity of the investigation, and he frames this as an ethical stance, a commitment to staying with the question even when it offers no reward, and this ethic resonates with the most restrained episodes of The Proof is Out There, where the absence of resolution becomes the point, inviting viewers to sit with ambiguity rather than flee from it. And as Part 6 nears its conclusion, Daniel considers the possibility that future disclosure, if it comes, may not arrive as a dramatic revelation but as a slow recalibration of what we consider normal, a gradual expansion of the category of the unexplained until it loses its power to shock, and he wonders whether this would represent progress or defeat, assimilation or enlightenment, and the part ends with Daniel observing a night sky increasingly crowded with human-made objects, satellites glinting like artificial stars, and he notes with quiet irony that as the sky becomes more familiar, the truly unfamiliar may become harder to see, not because it is gone but because it no longer fits the stories we tell ourselves about what belongs there, and standing beneath this layered sky, human and otherwise, he recognizes that the search for proof is inseparable from the search for attention, what we choose to notice and what we allow ourselves to ignore, and it is this choice, he realizes, that may ultimately determine whether the phenomenon remains out there or slips silently past us. And so, with the investigation now pressing against the future as much as the past, I ask you, Daniel Cross enters the 7th phase of his investigation with a growing awareness that the phenomenon cannot be fully approached from the sky alone, because while orbs, radar tracks, and crash debris dominate public imagination, they represent only the most visible surface of something far more diffuse, and in Part 7 the narrative deliberately shifts downward, into infrastructure, geography, and the silent architectures of power that shape where and how the unknown reveals itself, aligning closely with one of the more understated yet unsettling currents in the proof is out there, namely the recurring correlation between unidentified phenomena and sites of strategic importance. And Daniel frames this part around a deceptively simple question, not what these objects are, but where they choose to appear, and as he compiles maps layered with decades of sightings, a pattern emerges that resists coincidence. Clusters forming around nuclear facilities, weapons depots, testing ranges, deep-sea cables, and communication hubs, places where human civilization concentrates both destructive potential and informational flow. And Daniel is careful to emphasize that correlation does not imply intent, yet he refuses to ignore the statistical weight of repetition, because patterns, even ambiguous ones, are the language through which the unknown often speaks. And this realization pulls him back into Cold War archives where KGB analysts quietly wrestled with the same cartographic anomalies, noting repeated intrusions near missile silos while publicly insisting that no such intrusions occurred. And Daniel juxtaposes these findings with declassified NATO assessments that echo the same concern in different language, revealing a rare symmetry between rival systems, a shared unease that transcended ideology, and this symmetry becomes a narrative hinge, because it suggests that whatever the phenomenon represents, it does not recognize political borders, yet it consistently intersects with the most guarded expressions of state power. And Daniel explores several possible explanations without privileging any single one, ranging from mundane hypotheses such as heightened sensor density near sensitive sites, which increases detection probability, to more provocative possibilities involving surveillance, deterrence signaling, or even accidental interaction with human technological emissions, and he treats each hypothesis with equal rigor, refusing to collapse complexity into comfort. And this disciplined refusal becomes increasingly difficult as he interviews a former nuclear security officer who recounts an incident in which multiple glowing objects hovered above a restricted facility, temporarily disabling external sensors before vanishing, an event officially attributed to equipment malfunction but privately described as externally induced interference. And Daniel notes how the officer's account mirrors similar testimonies from entirely different geopolitical contexts, reinforcing the sense that certain experiences repeat regardless of who observes them. And he reflects on how the proof is out there often presents such cases not as smoking guns but as stress tests, moments that strain existing explanatory frameworks without quite breaking them, and this strain becomes the emotional undercurrent of Part 7. Because Daniel increasingly senses that the phenomenon presses against the limits of control rather than knowledge, revealing vulnerabilities not in our understanding of physics but in our assumptions about dominance, surveillance, and security, and he explores this idea by examining the language of threat assessment itself, noting how unidentified objects are frequently described as non-hostile but unknown, a classification that leaves institutions in an awkward limbo, because security doctrine is built around identifiable adversaries, not ambiguous presences, and Daniel argues that this limbo may explain why such incidents are quietly sidelined, not out of deception but because they resist operational integration, and this insight allows him to reinterpret decades of silence not as conspiracy but as systemic discomfort, a collective hesitation to acknowledge phenomena that destabilize foundational assumptions about control. And the narrative deepens as Daniel turns his attention to undersea encounters, cases involving unidentified submerged objects that move seamlessly between water and air. Reports that receive far less attention yet mirror aerial sightings in behavior and mystery, and he studies naval logs, describing sonar contacts that accelerate beyond known limits, objects that appear to shadow submarines before disappearing into thermal layers, and he is struck by how closely these reports resemble orb encounters in the sky, substituting depth for altitude but preserving the same refusal to conform. And Daniel speculates that the phenomenon may not be aerial at all in origin, but domain agnostic, interacting with any environment where human technology reaches its limits. and he treats this speculation cautiously, aware of how quickly it could slide into unfalsifiable territory. Yet he cannot ignore how often witnesses describe transitions between mediums as if the objects obey a different set of constraints altogether. And this leads him to a sobering realization that humanity may be encountering not a rival intelligence but a different mode of existence, one that intersects with our own only incidentally, much as deep-sea creatures occasionally intersect with surface vessels without understanding them. And this metaphor resonates deeply with Daniel, because it reframes the phenomenon from confrontation to coexistence, from invasion to overlap, and he recognizes that such a reframing would radically alter the cultural narrative surrounding UFOs, dissolving fear-driven assumptions while introducing a more unsettling humility, the recognition that we may not be the primary agents in every story we inhabit. And as Part 7 unfolds, Daniel examines how governments quietly prepare for uncertainty without naming it, funding research into anomalous propulsion, sensor resilience, and electromagnetic interference under the guise of defense innovation. And he argues that these investments represent a tacit acknowledgement of persistent unknowns, even as official rhetoric remains cautious. And he contrasts this with public discourse that oscillates between ridicule and revelation, noting how little space exists for sustained ambiguity, and Daniel positions the proof is out there as a rare cultural artifact willing to inhabit that space, not to resolve it but to normalize it, and this normalization, he suggests, may be the most radical response to the phenomenon yet, because it undermines the binary logic of belief versus disbelief, replacing it with patient attention. And as he synthesizes these threads, the narrative of Part 7 becomes increasingly philosophical, exploring how power structures react when faced with phenomena they cannot dominate or fully understand, and Daniel draws parallels to historical encounters between civilizations at different technological stages, emphasizing how misunderstanding often breeds myth, fear, and overreaction. And he cautions that similar dynamics could unfold here if the unknown were ever definitively confirmed, not because of the phenomenon itself but because of human response. And this leads him to a crucial ethical question: whether humanity is psychologically prepared for sustained ambiguity on a civilizational scale, and whether institutions designed for control can adapt to coexistence with uncertainty. And Daniel does not pretend to answer this question, instead allowing it to hover unresolved, much like the orbs themselves. And in the closing movement of Part 7 he returns to the maps that began the chapter, now layered not only with sightings but with human infrastructure, power plants, data centers, shipping lanes, and communication relays. And he sees in these overlays a stark visualization of vulnerability, a reminder that the phenomenon intersects most often with the systems we rely on most deeply. And he wonders whether this is coincidence, consequence, or communication, and the ambiguity of that question lingers as the part draws to a close, because Daniel recognizes that to ask why the phenomenon appears where it does is ultimately to ask why we have built our world the way we have, clustering risk, power, and attention into fragile nodes. And he realizes that even if the mystery were solved tomorrow, its reflection on human civilization would remain, forcing a reckoning not with visitors from elsewhere but with ourselves, our priorities, and our assumptions about mastery. And so, standing at the intersection of sky, sea, and system, Daniel Cross moves into Part 8 with the heavy awareness that the investigation has reached a psychological inflection point, because after geography, infrastructure, and power, the next unavoidable layer is belief itself. Not belief as faith or ideology but belief as a cognitive survival mechanism, the quiet framework through which humans assign meaning to uncertainty. And Daniel recognizes that the proof is out there, has always walked a careful line here, acknowledging belief without endorsing dogma, dissecting conviction without humiliating it. And so this part deliberately turns inward, examining how belief forms, hardens, fractures, and sometimes replaces evidence when evidence refuses to arrive. And Daniel begins by analyzing the evolution of UFO belief communities over the decades, noting how early enthusiasts framed the phenomenon through the optimistic lens of post-war futurism, imagining benevolent visitors and cosmic brotherhood, while later generations, shaped by geopolitical anxiety and technological surveillance, gravitated toward darker narratives of intrusion, abduction, and manipulation. And Daniel argues that these shifts say less about the phenomenon itself and more about the psychological climate of the eras interpreting it. And he situates this observation within a broader theory that unidentified phenomena function as cultural mirrors, reflecting dominant fears and aspirations back at the societies that observe them, and this theory gains traction as he compares Cold War-era Soviet accounts, which often emphasized espionage and sabotage, with contemporary narratives that focus on secrecy, control, and lost autonomy. And Daniel does not dismiss these narratives as mere projection, instead treating them as data points that reveal how the unknown interacts with collective anxiety, shaping stories that feel intuitively true even when they lack empirical grounding. And this approach allows him to discuss one of the most contentious aspects of the phenomenon, abduction accounts, with a level of nuance often absent from public debate, because Daniel is keenly aware that such accounts sit at the intersection of personal trauma, cultural symbolism, and neurological phenomena, and he interviews clinicians who have worked with individuals reporting abduction-like experiences, learning how sleep paralysis, dissociation, and hypnagogic hallucinations can produce vivid, convincing encounters, yet he also listens to patients describe the emotional aftermath of these experiences, the sense of violation, confusion, and isolation that persists regardless of origin, and Daniel refuses to trivialize this suffering by reducing it to pathology alone, arguing instead that the experiences, real or not in a literal sense, exert real psychological force, and this ethical stance becomes central to Part 8, because it underscores Daniel's growing conviction that the most irresponsible response to the phenomenon is not belief or disbelief but dismissal, the refusal to engage seriously with experiences that unsettle normative reality. And he contrasts this with how the proof is out there often contextualizes extraordinary claims within scientific and psychological frameworks without ridiculing the individuals who make them, and this respectful skepticism, Daniel believes, is the only viable path forward in a landscape saturated with extremes. And as Part 8 unfolds, Daniel turns his attention to conspiracy theories, not as fringe curiosities but as structured belief systems that emerge when institutional trust erodes, and he traces how secrecy around UFO investigations, particularly during the Cold War, created fertile ground for elaborate narratives of hidden agreements, suppressed technologies, and clandestine alliances. And while Daniel acknowledges that some conspiracies arise from genuine deception and obfuscation, he argues that many persist because they provide narrative closure where official explanations do not, offering emotionally satisfying answers in place of unresolved questions. And this insight leads him to a sobering realization that the longer ambiguity persists, the more likely belief systems will crystallize around it, hardening into identities resistant to revision. And Daniel worries that this crystallization threatens the very inquiry he values. Because once belief becomes identity, evidence becomes secondary, filtered through allegiance rather than curiosity. And he examines online communities where UFO discourse has polarized into absolutist camps, each convinced not only of its own correctness but of the other's moral failure. And Daniel recognizes this pattern from other domains of modern life, seeing in it a broader crisis of epistemology, a fragmentation of shared reality where consensus dissolves under the pressure of information overload and mistrust. And he argues that the UFO phenomenon has become a particularly potent battleground for this crisis precisely because it resists definitive resolution, acting as a stress test for how societies handle uncertainty. And this framing allows Daniel to reinterpret the proof is out there as more than a show about unexplained phenomena, positioning it instead as a cultural experiment, a public rehearsal for living with unanswered questions. And he suggests that the show's insistence on measured analysis and unresolved endings may frustrate some viewers precisely because it denies the comfort of belief, forcing them to confront ambiguity without escape. And this discomfort, Daniel argues, is not a flaw but a feature, because it mirrors the psychological challenge posed by the phenomenon itself. And as Part 8 deepens, Daniel introduces a historical parallel that reframes the entire debate, comparing UFO belief systems to early responses to natural phenomena like earthquakes and eclipses, which were once attributed to divine or supernatural forces until scientific frameworks gradually absorbed them. And he cautions against assuming a similar trajectory here, noting that some mysteries resist absorption not because they are supernatural but because they sit at the edge of multiple disciplines, falling through the cracks between physics, psychology, sociology, and philosophy, and this interdisciplinarity, Daniel suggests, may explain why the phenomenon persists, not as a single problem to be solved but as a convergence of many unsolved problems, and this realization tempers his earlier frustration, offering a new form of patience rooted not in expectation of revelation but in acceptance of complexity, and he reflects on his own shifting beliefs, admitting that he no longer seeks a singular answer to the question of UFOs, extraterrestrial or otherwise, but rather a clearer understanding of how humans respond to the unknown, how curiosity, fear, imagination, and power interact to produce meaning. And this inward turn reaches a quiet climax when Daniel attends a public lecture where a physicist presents a dismissive overview of UFO claims, triggering heated reactions from the audience, and Daniel observes the exchange not as a debate over facts but as a collision of worldviews, each side defending not just an interpretation of evidence but a vision of how reality itself should behave, and he recognizes that for many, belief in UFOs is less about aliens than about resisting a worldview that feels overly constrained, while for skeptics, dismissal serves as a defense against chaos, a way to preserve the integrity of known systems, and Daniel finds himself empathizing with both impulses, understanding that each arises from a legitimate human need, and this empathy becomes the moral anchor of Part 8, because it allows him to hold conflicting perspectives without collapsing into relativism. And he argues that maturity in inquiry lies not in choosing sides but in maintaining dialogue across them. And this argument carries personal weight as Daniel reflects on how his work has strained relationships with colleagues and friends who interpret his neutrality as indecision or weakness, and he admits to moments of loneliness, the cost of refusing to align fully with any camp, yet he accepts this cost as necessary, recognizing that the space between belief and disbelief is where meaningful questions survive. And as Part 8 draws toward its end, Daniel returns to the metaphor of debris, not physical fragments but ideological ones, shards of belief scattered by encounters with the unexplained, and he suggests that just as crash debris invites analysis rather than immediate conclusion, belief debris should be examined with care, acknowledging its origins and impacts without mistaking it for the object itself. And this metaphor resonates as he contemplates the future of the phenomenon, wondering whether increasing transparency will dissolve extreme beliefs or merely reshape them. And he concludes that no amount of data alone can resolve what is fundamentally a human challenge, the challenge of living in a universe that does not owe us clarity. And in the final image of Part 8, Daniel sits alone reviewing footage of a simple orb hovering silently against a dark sky. An image stripped of narrative, motive, and explanation, and he realizes that beneath layers of belief, skepticism, and theory lies something profoundly simple, an encounter with not knowing. And he accepts that this encounter may be the most honest outcome of the investigation, because it preserves humility, curiosity, and restraint, qualities increasingly rare in an age of certainty. And so, with belief examined and left deliberately unsettled, Daniel Cross approaches Part 9 with a quiet but undeniable shift in posture, because after belief, after secrecy, after power and perception, the investigation now presses against consequence, not hypothetical consequence but lived, historical consequence, the measurable ways in which encounters with the unexplained have altered decisions, policies, careers, and trajectories, and Daniel realizes that while the proof is out there often presents mysteries as unresolved, those mysteries nevertheless leave footprints, subtle but persistent changes in behavior that ripple outward from the moment of encounter. And it is these ripples that form the core of this part. As Daniel begins to track how unidentified phenomena have influenced technological development, military doctrine, and even scientific imagination, often indirectly, often without acknowledgement. And he frames this exploration around a deceptively modest question: what happens after the sighting ends, after the footage stops, after the report is filed, because that is where the true story may lie. And Daniel begins by examining aerospace innovation during the Cold War, noting how sudden bursts of research funding often followed periods of intense UFO reporting near strategic sites, not because officials believed in extraterrestrial craft, but because anomalies exposed gaps in detection, tracking, and response capabilities. And Daniel interviews historians who explain how these gaps justified Investments in radar resolution, signal processing, and materials science, advancements that later fed into civilian technologies, and this reframing unsettles simplistic narratives of UFOs as distractions or delusions, suggesting instead that even unresolved mysteries can function as catalysts, driving progress by revealing the limits of existing systems, and Daniel is careful not to overstate this influence, acknowledging that correlation does not equal causation. Yet he insists that patterns of response matter as much as the triggers themselves, and from here the narrative widens to include the Soviet side, where KGB and military analysts quietly incorporated UFO scenarios into war games and contingency planning, not as alien invasions but as unknown intrusions capable of destabilizing command and control structures. And Daniel finds declassified documents that treat unidentified objects as stressors designed to test system resilience, a framing that reframes the phenomenon as an inadvertent auditor of human preparedness. And this idea fascinates him because it suggests that the unknown, regardless of origin, forces adaptation simply by existing, and Daniel draws a parallel to natural disasters, which similarly expose vulnerabilities without intent, yet unlike earthquakes or storms, UFO phenomena carry intentional ambiguity, the unsettling sense of agency without confirmation, and this ambiguity amplifies their impact, prompting overcorrection, secrecy, and myth-making. In equal measure, and as Part 9 unfolds, Daniel turns his attention to the scientific community, exploring how UFO stigma has shaped research priorities, discouraging open inquiry into certain atmospheric, electromagnetic, or propulsion anomalies for fear of association, and he interviews a retired physicist who admits that early career curiosity about unexplained aerial data was quietly redirected towards safer topics, not through overt censorship but through funding incentives and peer pressure. And Daniel recognizes this as another form of consequence, intellectual paths not taken, questions deferred indefinitely, and he reflects on how the proof is out there occasionally surfaces these missed opportunities, hinting at parallel scientific histories that might have unfolded had curiosity been less constrained by reputation. And this reflection deepens into a meditation on lost time, not in the paranormal sense but in the human sense, years spent avoiding questions rather than refining them, and Daniel wonders how many insights lie dormant because they were once deemed embarrassing, and from science he moves to policy, examining how modern disclosure frameworks emerged not from sudden enlightenment but from accumulated frustration, decades of unresolved cases that eroded the credibility of blanket denial. And Daniel traces the slow shift toward cautious acknowledgement, noting how language softened from dismissal to admission of uncertainty, and he interprets this shift not as revelation but as fatigue, institutions gradually conceding that silence had become more damaging than ambiguity, and this interpretation aligns with his broader thesis that consequence accumulates even when answers do not, forcing adaptation through pressure rather than clarity. And as Part 9 progresses, Daniel confronts a more intimate set of consequences, the personal costs borne by individuals who chose to speak publicly about their encounters, pilots grounded, officers sidelined, scientists ridiculed, and he compiles these stories not as cautionary tales but as evidence of a cultural immune response, a system reacting defensively to perceived threats to coherence, and Daniel treats this response with nuance, acknowledging that skepticism protects against deception and delusion, yet he argues that excessive skepticism can become punitive, discouraging honest reporting and distorting data pools, and he frames this dynamic as a feedback loop, where stigma reduces reporting, reduced reporting increases anomaly, and anomaly intensifies stigma, a cycle that perpetuates uncertainty. And Daniel sees in this loop a structural explanation for why the phenomenon remains unresolved, not because evidence is absent but because it is selectively filtered, and this insight sharpens his critique of binary debates, belief versus disbelief, arguing that both extremes contribute to distortion, belief by overinterpreting, disbelief by underreporting, and he positions disciplined ambiguity as the only sustainable stance, a stance that accepts consequence without demanding closure. And this stance becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as Daniel examines one of the most controversial consequences of all, the emergence of alternative narratives that fill the vacuum left by official uncertainty, narratives involving hidden technologies, secret treaties, and suppressed breakthroughs, and while Daniel remains skeptical of these claims, he acknowledges their sociological function, providing meaning and agency in a landscape dominated by silence, and he argues that dismissing such narratives outright ignores the conditions that produce them, conditions rooted in mistrust and asymmetry of information, and he draws a parallel to earlier eras where unexplained disease or natural phenomena generated elaborate cosmologies, not because people were foolish but because explanation is a psychological necessity, and this historical framing allows Daniel to approach conspiracy culture with empathy without endorsement, recognizing it as a symptom rather than a cause, and as Part 9 deepens, Daniel turns toward the concept of legacy, how unresolved mysteries shape future generations, and he examines educational materials, noting how UFO topics are often omitted entirely, creating an artificial absence that students later fill through less reliable sources, and he wonders whether a more honest pedagogical approach, acknowledging uncertainty without sensationalism, might produce healthier engagement, and he imagines a future where unidentified phenomena are treated as open research questions rather than taboo subjects, integrated into curricula as case studies in epistemology, scientific method, and cognitive bias, and this imagination offers him a rare moment of optimism, because it suggests that consequence need not be corrosive, that unresolved questions can cultivate humility rather than fear, and this optimism is tempered by realism as Daniel acknowledges the inertia of institutions, the difficulty of reforming systems designed for certainty, and he reflects on how the proof is out there occupies a precarious middle ground, criticized by skeptics for indulging mystery and by believers for resisting revelation, yet he argues that this very precariousness gives the show its value, functioning as a buffer zone where consequence can be examined without immediate resolution. And as Part 9 nears its conclusion, Daniel synthesizes these threads into a single, sobering insight, that the most significant impact of UFO phenomena may already have occurred, not in the form of contact or catastrophe but in the slow reshaping of how humanity relates to uncertainty, how institutions learn to admit limits, how individuals negotiate belief and doubt, and how societies manage the discomfort of not knowing, and he suggests that in this sense the phenomenon has already succeeded, whatever its origin, by forcing a reckoning with epistemological humility, and this humility, Daniel argues, may be humanity's most valuable adaptive trait in an increasingly complex universe. And the part ends not with an image of the sky but with an image of paperwork, reports stamped inconclusive, archives labeled unresolved, and Daniel recognizes that these mundane artifacts represent the true debris field of the phenomenon, not shattered craft but accumulated ambiguity, and he accepts that living amid such debris is not a failure but a condition of honest inquiry, and so, with consequence laid bare and closure still withheld. Part 10 opens with Daniel Cross confronting a realization that unsettles him more than any orb footage or declassified memo he has examined so far, the realization that uncertainty itself has begun to behave like a system, adaptive, self-preserving, and strangely efficient, because as he surveys decades of investigations surrounding unidentified aerial phenomena, he notices that ambiguity is not merely the absence of answers but an actively maintained condition shaped by institutional incentives, cultural reflexes, and human psychology, and this insight reframes the question entirely, shifting focus away from what the phenomena are and toward why clarity remains perpetually deferred. And Daniel introduces this part by describing a pattern he has observed across multiple governments and eras, a cycle in which moments of apparent progress toward explanation are followed by strategic pauses, reframings, or compartmentalizations that dissipate momentum without overt suppression, and he argues that this cycle does not require conspiracy to function, only bureaucratic logic, because systems designed to manage risk tend to default toward minimizing disruption rather than maximizing truth, and UFO phenomena, regardless of origin, represent disruption in its purest form, an intrusion that resists categorization, and Daniel emphasizes that this resistance threatens not just security but narrative coherence. The story's institutions tell themselves to justify authority, and from this premise he dives into a detailed examination of language, how official terminology evolves not to clarify but to neutralize, from flying saucers to UFOs to UAPs, each shift stripping away imagery while preserving uncertainty, And Daniel is careful not to mock this evolution, recognizing that precision can reduce panic, yet he also notes how abstraction distances the public emotionally, transforming visceral encounters into technical anomalies, and this distancing becomes a tool, not of deception but of containment, and as he traces internal memos and press briefings, Daniel observes how phrasing consistently emphasizes lack of threat over lack of understanding, prioritizing reassurance above inquiry. And this prioritization reveals an implicit hierarchy of values: safety first, truth second, curiosity last. And Daniel asks whether such a hierarchy is sustainable in a world where information leaks freely and public skepticism grows sharper with each contradiction. And he connects this to The Proof Is Out There itself, positioning the show as a countercurrent that restores narrative texture to phenomena flattened by official discourse, yet he acknowledges the paradox that by dramatizing uncertainty, the show risks reinforcing it, feeding a public appetite for mystery that institutions then use as justification for continued opacity. And this recursive dynamic fascinates Daniel because it suggests that media, government, and audience are locked in a mutually reinforcing loop, each responding to the other in ways that stabilize ambiguity. And from here Part 10 turns toward technology, specifically the role of sensor proliferation in transforming the UFO debate. As Daniel notes that modern skies are saturated with cameras, radar, satellites, and civilian tracking tools, creating an unprecedented volume of data, yet paradoxically this abundance has not produced resolution, instead generating noise that overwhelms analysis. And Daniel interviews data scientists who explain how pattern recognition systems struggle with edge cases, anomalies that fall outside trained parameters. And he draws an analogy to biological immune systems that sometimes attack benign cells because they do not match expected signatures. And this analogy deepens his argument that our detection technologies may be amplifying uncertainty rather than resolving it, flagging ever more anomalies without improving interpretive frameworks. And Daniel reflects on how early UFO cases were sparse but dramatic, while modern cases are plentiful but ambiguous, and he wonders whether the phenomenon has changed or whether perception has shifted under the weight of instrumentation. And this leads him into a meditation on visibility, how increased surveillance does not necessarily produce transparency, because seeing more does not mean understanding more. And Daniel extends this insight to human cognition, suggesting that our brains, like our machines, are optimized for pattern recognition, not anomaly accommodation, and thus we oscillate between forcing unknowns into familiar categories and rejecting them outright, both responses reinforcing uncertainty. And as Part 10 unfolds, Daniel confronts the emotional dimension of this oscillation, exploring how repeated exposure to unresolved phenomena produces fatigue rather than curiosity, a dulling effect where each new case feels simultaneously intriguing and exhausting. And he argues that this fatigue benefits institutions by reducing pressure for answers, yet it also corrodes public trust, creating a cynical baseline where no explanation is fully believed. And Daniel sees this cynicism reflected in online discourse, where skepticism often shades into nihilism, and belief into performative certainty. And he traces how this polarization mirrors broader societal divides, suggesting that UFO discourse has become a microcosm of epistemic crisis, a testing ground for how societies negotiate truth in an age of contested authority. And Daniel does not exempt himself from this critique, admitting moments where his own investigation felt trapped between fascination and futility. And he shares an anecdote about rereading a case file late at night, realizing that every plausible explanation introduced new uncertainties. And this recursive doubt left him strangely calm rather than anxious, because it forced him to accept limits. And this acceptance becomes a thematic pivot in Part 10, as Daniel explores the idea that unresolved phenomena might require a new ethic of inquiry, one that values process over outcome, humility over mastery. And he draws on philosophy of science to argue that not all questions are meant to be closed. Some serve as boundary markers that define the edges of current understanding, and UFO phenomena, he suggests, may function as such markers, constantly reminding humanity of epistemic horizons. And this philosophical turn leads Daniel to revisit historical cases, not to reanalyze evidence but to examine how investigators framed their own ignorance, highlighting moments where officials openly admitted uncertainty without embarrassment, and he contrasts these moments with later eras of rigid denial, arguing that confidence in uncertainty may paradoxically require greater institutional strength than confidence in explanation. And this insight reframes disclosure debates, shifting focus from releasing answers to modeling honesty. And Daniel imagines a form of disclosure that says simply, "We do not know, and here is why," accompanied by transparent methodology and open data, and he acknowledges the risks of such openness: misinterpretation, exploitation, panic, yet he argues that these risks already exist under current opacity, and that transparency might redistribute rather than eliminate them. And as Part 10 deepens, Daniel examines how cultural narratives shape expectations of disclosure, particularly the persistent belief that revelation will be singular and transformative, a moment of truth that resolves ambiguity in one stroke. And he challenges this belief as a product of storytelling rather than history, noting that most scientific revolutions unfolded gradually, through accumulation and revision rather than epiphany. And he suggests that expecting a dramatic reveal sets the public up for perpetual disappointment, reinforcing the cycle of mistrust. And this critique extends to entertainment, including "The proof is out there," as Daniel questions whether episodic framing inadvertently reinforces the expectation of resolution, even when episodes end inconclusively. And he reflects on his own narrative choices, recognizing the tension between storytelling and fidelity to uncertainty. And this self-awareness adds a metalayer to Part 10, as Daniel becomes both subject and object of his analysis, and he acknowledges that writing about UFOs risks aestheticizing ambiguity, turning not knowing into a consumable experience, and he wrestles with whether this aestheticization diminishes the seriousness of inquiry or sustains interest long enough for deeper engagement. And he does not resolve this tension, instead presenting it as another consequence of the phenomenon. And as the part approaches its end, Daniel turns to the future, not in terms of imminent contact or disclosure, but in terms of generational shift, noting that younger scientists and analysts show less stigma toward anomaly research, viewing it as data-rich rather than taboo, and he sees cautious hope in interdisciplinary approaches that combine physics, psychology, atmospheric science, and data analysis, and he argues that the most productive path forward may not be a dedicated UFO program but a network of open questions embedded across fields, diluting stigma by normalizing curiosity. And this vision aligns with his broader thesis that integration, not isolation, is the antidote to uncertainty paralysis. And in the closing movement of Part 10, Daniel returns to the image of the sky, not as a canvas for mystery but as a mirror reflecting human limits, and he suggests that the phenomenon endures because it sits at the intersection of perception, power, and meaning, resisting reduction to any single domain. And he concludes that perhaps the proof is not out there in the sense of a definitive artifact or explanation, but out there as a challenge, a persistent invitation to refine how we ask questions, how we tolerate ambiguity, and how we remain curious without surrendering rigor. And the part ends with Daniel pausing mid-sentence in a recorded interview, listening as a technician mentions another anomalous blip on a screen, and Daniel smiles faintly, not with excitement or dread, but with recognition, understanding that the cycle continues not because humanity has failed, but because it is still learning how to look without insisting on certainty. And with that understanding laid bare, Part 11 unfolds in a quieter register, yet it is perhaps the most unsettling chapter Daniel Cross has written so far, because here the investigation turns inward, away from institutions, technologies, and public narratives, and toward the subtle psychological terrain where the phenomenon ultimately resides, the space where perception, memory, expectation, and identity intersect. And Daniel begins by acknowledging something he has resisted throughout the investigation: the realization that no matter how advanced sensors become or how transparent governments claim to be, every encounter with the unknown is ultimately filtered through human consciousness, and this filter is neither neutral nor consistent. And rather than treating this as a flaw to be eliminated, Daniel frames it as a core component of the mystery itself, arguing that UFO phenomena cannot be fully understood without understanding how humans experience ambiguity. And he opens Part 11 with an account of revisiting witnesses years after their original sightings, noting how stories have not simply remained static but have evolved, not always toward embellishment but toward coherence, as if the mind, intolerant of unresolved narratives, gradually edits memory to impose meaning, and Daniel treats these changes with respect rather than suspicion, emphasizing that memory is not a recording device but a living process, shaped by reflection, conversation, and cultural context. And he notes that witnesses who once described confusion often later articulate certainty, not because new evidence emerged, but because uncertainty proved psychologically exhausting. And this observation becomes a central thread as Daniel explores how belief functions as a stabilizing force, a way to anchor identity in the face of the inexplicable. And he is careful to distinguish belief from gullibility, arguing that belief often arises not from ignorance but from prolonged exposure to ambiguity, a coping mechanism rather than a conclusion. And this insight reframes many public debates, suggesting that clashes between skeptics and believers are less about evidence and more about tolerance for unresolved tension. And Daniel interviews psychologists who explain how humans vary widely in their threshold for ambiguity, with some finding it stimulating and others deeply distressing. And this variation, Daniel argues, may explain why UFO phenomena polarize so intensely, acting as a kind of psychological Rorschach test onto which individuals project fears, hopes, or worldviews. And as Part 11 develops, Daniel examines how this projection operates at a collective level, tracing how different cultures interpret similar aerial anomalies through vastly different symbolic frameworks: angels, omens, secret weapons, extraterrestrials. And he suggests that the phenomenon itself may be less important than the interpretive scaffolding societies build around it. And this does not trivialize the sightings but contextualizes them, emphasizing that meaning emerges through interpretation. And Daniel reflects on how the proof is out there navigates this terrain by juxtaposing expert analysis with personal testimony, creating a tension between explanation and experience that mirrors the viewer's own internal negotiation. And he admits that earlier in his career he privileged explanation almost exclusively, viewing subjective experience as noise. Yet years of exposure to consistent, emotionally coherent testimony have eroded this hierarchy, forcing him to acknowledge that experience, while not proof, is data of a different kind. And this acknowledgement marks a subtle shift in his methodology, one that values phenomenology alongside instrumentation. And from here Part 11 moves into the domain of fear, not sensational fear of invasion or catastrophe, but a quieter existential fear, the fear of ontological disruption, the possibility that reality may be stranger and less orderly than assumed. And Daniel argues that this fear underlies much resistance to UFO discourse, because accepting the persistence of unexplained phenomena threatens foundational assumptions about human centrality, technological mastery, and epistemic closure. And he connects this fear to historical moments when dominant worldviews were challenged: the Copernican shift, evolutionary theory, quantum mechanics, noting how each provoked not just scientific debate but cultural anxiety. And he positions UFO phenomena as a similar, though unresolved, pressure point, a question mark hovering over modernity's confidence in its own comprehensiveness. And as Part 11 deepens, Daniel confronts the role of identity among investigators themselves, observing how careers, reputations, and self-concepts become entangled with positions taken on the phenomenon. And he recounts conversations with analysts who privately admit uncertainty but publicly maintain firm stances, not out of dishonesty but out of self-preservation, because to vacillate openly would destabilize professional identity. And Daniel recognizes this dynamic as another consequence of prolonged ambiguity, the hardening of positions to protect coherence. And he reflects on his own discomfort when readers or viewers ask him what he really believes, noting how the question itself presupposes that belief is inevitable, that prolonged exposure must culminate in commitment. And he admits that resisting this expectation has become increasingly difficult. Yet he insists that maintaining suspension is not cowardice but discipline, a refusal to collapse complexity into narrative closure. And this insistence becomes a quiet act of resistance against both sensationalism and dismissal. And as Part 11 progresses, Daniel turns to the role of trauma in shaping encounters, exploring cases where sightings coincide with periods of personal stress, loss, or transition. And he is careful not to pathologize witnesses, emphasizing that heightened sensitivity during such periods may increase awareness of anomalies rather than fabricate them. And he draws on research showing that during liminal life phases, Humans are more attentive to patterns and meaning, and Daniel suggests that UFO experiences may function as symbolic anchors during such times, providing structure to chaos, and this symbolic function, he argues, does not negate the reality of the experience but reveals its layered nature, physical stimulus intertwined with psychological resonance, and from here he explores the ethics of investigation, questioning how researchers and media should engage with witnesses whose experiences carry profound emotional weight, and he critiques approaches that treat testimony purely as evidentiary fodder, stripped of context, arguing that such extraction can be re-traumatizing, and he praises moments in the proof is out there where skepticism is applied without cruelty, where analysts challenge claims while respecting the sincerity of experience, and he presents this balance as an ethical ideal, difficult to maintain yet essential if inquiry is to remain humane, and as Part 11 moves toward its latter half, Daniel examines how prolonged engagement with the phenomenon alters perception itself, recounting his own experience of scanning skies unconsciously, noticing patterns of light he once ignored, and he reflects on how curiosity reshapes attention, making the ordinary feel provisional, and he wonders whether this heightened vigilance is a gift or a burden, because while it enriches awareness, it also erodes the comfort of assumption, and he connects this to a broader cultural shift toward hypervigilance in an era of constant alerts and notifications, suggesting that UFO discourse may resonate now not because sightings have increased, but because societies are primed to notice anomalies, to interpret disruption as meaningful, and this resonance amplifies both wonder and anxiety, and Daniel situates the phenomenon within this attentional economy, where meaning competes with overload, and as Part 11 nears its conclusion, Daniel returns to the theme of humility, arguing that perhaps the most radical implication of UFO phenomena is not technological or extraterrestrial but ethical, the call to accept limits without resignation, to remain curious without conquest, and he contrasts this ethic with dominant narratives of exploration that frame the unknown as something to be mastered or exploited, and he suggests that UFO phenomena resist such framing, offering no clear resource, no clear enemy, no clear victory, only persistent uncertainty, and this resistance, Daniel argues, may be instructive, challenging humanity to develop forms of engagement that do not rely on domination, and this idea leads him to a final reflection on silence, not institutional silence but existential silence, the gaps between questions and answers where meaning is negotiated rather than declared. And he suggests that learning to inhabit these gaps may be one of the most difficult yet necessary skills in an increasingly complex world, and the part closes with Daniel recounting a moment after a long interview, standing alone under a night sky that appears utterly ordinary, no lights, no anomalies, just darkness and stars, and he realizes that the absence of phenomena can be as instructive as their presence, because it reminds him that mystery does not require spectacle to persist. And with that realization, with the psychological landscape laid bare and belief reframed as response rather than conclusion, Part 12 arrives not as a climax but as a settling, the way dust slowly returns to the ground after an unseen disturbance, and Daniel Cross is acutely aware that ending this long inquiry does not mean resolving it, only choosing where to stop looking for the moment, and he opens the final part by acknowledging the paradox that has guided the entire journey, that investigations into the proof is out there promise answers while quietly teaching endurance. Endurance of ambiguity, endurance of incomplete narratives, endurance of questions that refuse to mature into conclusions, and Daniel frames this part as an attempt not to close the case but to step back far enough to see the outline of what has changed, not in the sky, not in classified archives, but in the investigators, the audience, and the cultural space where the phenomenon lives. And he begins by reflecting on how the idea of proof itself has subtly transformed over the course of the series, noting that early episodes leaned heavily on the expectation of decisive evidence, a fragment, a measurement, a document that would tip the scale, yet as seasons progressed, the emphasis shifted toward process, replication, and probability. And Daniel interprets this shift as a maturation, not a retreat, a recognition that some questions resist the courtroom model of proof and instead belong to the laboratory or the philosophical forum. And this recognition does not diminish rigor but redefines it, and from here Daniel surveys the accumulated cases one last time, not individually but collectively, noting that while no single event confirms extraordinary claims, the persistence of anomalies across geography, technology, and time undermines the comfort of total dismissal, and he argues that persistence itself is a form of data, not evidence of extraterrestrial origin but evidence of incomplete understanding, and this framing allows him to sidestep the false binary that has haunted the discourse, belief or debunking, replacing it with a spectrum of unresolved phenomena that demand differentiated responses rather than universal explanations. And Daniel emphasizes that one of the show's quiet achievements has been teaching viewers to tolerate this spectrum, to accept that some lights are drones, some debris is mundane, some signals are artifacts, and some cases remain stubbornly unclassifiable. And he suggests that intellectual honesty lies not in forcing these cases into a single narrative but in preserving their differences, and as part 12 deepens, Daniel turns to legacy, asking what remains after the cameras shut down and public attention drifts, and he argues that the most lasting impact of the proof is out there may not be any specific case but the normalization of asking careful questions about extraordinary claims, the modeling of skepticism without contempt and curiosity without credulity, and he notes how this balance has influenced a new generation of researchers, journalists, and enthusiasts who approach the phenomenon with methodological seriousness rather than ideological commitment, and Daniel sees in this shift a quiet cultural evolution, one that resists sensationalism while refusing erasure. And he contrasts this with earlier eras where UFO discourse oscillated wildly between panic and ridicule, suggesting that the current moment, while still fraught, offers a more stable platform for inquiry, and this stability, he argues, is essential if progress of any kind is to occur, because extreme positions exhaust themselves quickly, while moderate uncertainty can persist productively. And Daniel then confronts the question that inevitably shadows any conclusion: what if nothing ever comes of this? What if no definitive explanation emerges? And he answers not with reassurance but with reframing, arguing that many foundational aspects of reality were once persistent mysteries whose resolution did not diminish wonder but redistributed it, and he suggests that even if UFO phenomena are eventually explained through prosaic mechanisms, atmospheric physics, sensor artifacts, classified technology, the process of grappling with them has already enriched human understanding by exposing cognitive biases, institutional blind spots, and the social dynamics of belief, and this enrichment, Daniel insists, has intrinsic value independent of outcome, and as the final part unfolds, Daniel reflects on his own transformation, acknowledging that prolonged engagement with the unknown has not made him a believer nor a debunker but something less comfortable, a custodian of questions, and he admits that this role offers little closure but profound perspective, because it reveals how much human confidence rests on assumption rather than certainty, and he describes moments of frustration, the temptation to accept any explanation simply to end the search, and he recognizes this temptation as deeply human, yet he credits the discipline of inquiry with teaching restraint, the ability to say not yet without despair, and this discipline becomes the ethical core of his conclusion, as he argues that in an era saturated with instant answers and algorithmic certainty, the capacity to dwell in uncertainty is increasingly rare and increasingly vital, and Daniel expands this argument beyond UFOs, suggesting that climate science, artificial intelligence, and geopolitical risk all demand similar tolerance for complexity, similar resistance to simplistic narratives, and he proposes that the cultural training ground provided by UFO discourse may have broader relevance, teaching societies how to argue, doubt, and imagine responsibly, and this proposal lends the phenomenon a civic dimension, transforming it from fringe curiosity into a rehearsal space for epistemic resilience. And as Part 12 approaches its final movement, Daniel returns one last time to the imagery that has haunted the series: lights against dark skies, fragments recovered from impact sites, blurred footage replayed frame by frame, and he strips these images of their sensational charge, viewing them instead as symbols of human limitation, reminders that perception is partial and knowledge provisional, and he suggests that the true danger lies not in the unknown itself but in the refusal to acknowledge it, because denial breeds stagnation while obsession breeds distortion, and the path forward, he argues, lies in measured engagement, sustained curiosity guided by humility, and he acknowledges that this path is unsatisfying to those who crave revelation. Yet he insists that it is the only path compatible with intellectual integrity, and in the closing paragraphs Daniel addresses the audience directly, inviting them not to choose sides but to cultivate questions, to resist the pressure to resolve every mystery prematurely, and to recognize that wonder and rigor need not be enemies, and he frames the proof is out there not as a declaration but as an ongoing conversation, one that will continue long after this final episode fades, because the sky will remain open, technology will continue to evolve, and anomalies will persist at the edges of understanding, and he ends with a final, restrained image, not of a dramatic sighting or a shocking document, but of an empty monitoring room after hours, screens glowing softly, recording data no one is watching at that moment, and Daniel understands that meaning does not vanish in absence of observers. It accumulates quietly, waiting for the next question, and with that recognition, with no answers claimed and no mysteries resolved, the story concludes not with certainty but with continuity, and the proof, whatever it may ultimately be, remains out there, not as a promise of revelation, but as an invitation to keep looking, thinking, and questioning long after the last word is spoken.